Hello, everyone. My name is Chert, and I will be your host for today. So welcome to all the panelists, to all the people watching us on Zoom, and also to all the people on YouTube. The Liberate Data idea has a large end goal, putting all of humanity's data onto decentralized storage. We can imagine the idea in the case of public data. So open data, it could benefit from decentralized storage, from the peer-to-peer network that can be leveraged, spreading the load throughout the network, as well as providing redundancy. If we extend this idea to personal data, liberating personal data would mean that we set it free from the silos, make it available to individuals to share. Here, the ideas of personal data stores, data unions, and fair data economy can be pursued. An important part of maintaining data sets is governance. Many types of data are in public domain, a sort of commons like water or air for the data society and economy. The first part of the day is about commons in relations to data sharing infrastructure, specifically tackling swarm storage. So to start with, the trilateral team, Mistal, Aditya, and Robin, will present findings of the first stage of research delivered by them as part of the work conducted for their swarm grant. Do also take a look at their article posted on Fair Data Society blog. I will share the link later to chat and on Discord. The principles of the commons will be communicated along with a short overview of the commons relations to data sharing infrastructures, especially in the context of relations with data protection and fair data principles. This will be followed by a panel discussion. Provocations that emerge from the research will be presented there, and the goal of discussing the nuances of how the principles of the commons may be applied in practice, specifically also for swarm projects and the community in a wider sense. For that, Toby, as the former Chief Product Officer at the Wikimedia Foundation, will also join the panel to discuss and bring his perspective into it. We invite the audience to participate, and doing that by posing questions on Discord, possibly on the stage chat channel. We will pick them up and we'll forward them to the panelists. The second part of the day comprises of talks and demos by presenters implementing solutions on top of Swarm decentralized storage in various ways. This includes public as well as private data, and the presentations will be followed by a panel discussions exchanging their views and experience. So firstly, Salman will present how he solved the issue of converting Web2 apps to work with FairDrive personal storage using Freezer as the middle layer. Freezer is a pioneering effort by Salman to be a serverless application platform, offering decentralized storage access as an option for Web2 apps. Take note of Salman's article also on Fair Data Society blog. Is it time for serverless application platforms? Next, Mirko from Etherna will take the stage and present their project. We know that video sharing platforms play a very important role in today's age, both from a social as well as an economic perspective. So Etherna aims to be a video platform for everyone, promoting freedom of speech and using Web3 technologies. And thirdly, Amir and Cody will present social archive projects. So social networks are another important part of the digital society. We contribute to them with our content, yet we do not have complete control over it. Social archive projects provides a way to store data from your Twitter account and history into an archive on decentralized storage. As said, these presentations will lead to a panel discussion between the three projects, tackling the issue of is Web3 the solution to the problems with our data. And we will conclude with Yusuf from Clover Labs presenting the U Experience app that can be used by researchers and for citizen science use cases supporting self-sovereign storage. Mobile devices are a great way to log daily activities and gather research data. With self-sovereign storage, new possibilities open also for research participants to share their data. Let me bring to your attention the prizes available at the hackathon.wearemillions.online Gitcoin page. And to facilitate working with Swarm and FairOS, Fair Data Society has made available some endpoints for both B and so Swarm and FairOS that you can experiment with. If you need access to them, it may be best to join the Liberate Data directory channel on Discord and ask for access. So the program is long, so let's get going. So I invite to the stage Robin, Mistal, and Aditya. You can turn on your cameras and
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Chert, for the welcome. I'll share my screen now.
Hello. So I'll just hide myself for the time being.
Hopefully you can all see this slide. As I said, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are. This is the first session of the day, and it's entitled Keeping Things in Commons, the Principles of the Commons and their Relation to Data Sharing Infrastructures. We're going to give a short presentation, and then we will open up to a panel and bring in Toby Negrin. But before we get started, maybe it's good to just give a little bit of a hello and introduction to everyone. So first of all, I'm Robin. I work as a researcher at Trilateral Research, and I have interests mainly in privacy and blockchain technologies, as well as decentralization or decentralized architectures. Mistal, if you want to say hello.
Yeah, hi, I'm Mistal. I'm also a researcher at Trilateral Research, and I'm generally interested in digital privacy and data protection law.
Hi, my name is Aditya, and I'm a researcher, and I'm currently doing a PhD at the University of Edinburgh. My interest is in data ethics, data governance, and commons-based and collective approaches to governance, and how they might relate to decentralized architectures.
Fantastic. So I think we first should acknowledge Swarm. The grant that we received from them graciously gave kind of birth to a lot of the research that was conducted that we're going to present to you here. So thank you to them, and thank you to all the Swarm community that was involved in some of the initial conversations, kind of fleshing that out and trying to understand how our experience and expertise related to a lot of what Swarm was doing, as well as the wider Swarm ecosystem. So to get started, I'll pass over to Mistal, and she's going to talk you through some of the first slides before I'll hand over to Aditya.
Okay, thanks, Robin. So I'm just going to briefly present on how data flows, mostly personal data flows, but also some non-personal data flows have been regulated, both from a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach, and find a kind of happy medium which could apply in this context. So I guess contrary to popular belief, the notion of protecting personal data was kind of regulated, or at least officially, there was an official framework for it in the US before Europe. So in the 70s, you had the Federal Trade Commission in the early 70s protecting consumers and trying to maintain competition by releasing the Fair Information Practices, or as they're now called, the Fair Information Practice Principles. And this was to outline a set of principles to help maintain informational privacy in the electronic marketplace, so really consumer focused. And then after that, you had several European states subsequently enacting their own data protection laws, and they shifted to focus on the individual as a rights bearer and protecting that individual's privacy vis-a-vis this personal data processing, so information about them. And then at a supranational level, now we're kind of early 80s, you started to have organizations such as the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, released guidelines on the protection of privacy and transporter data flows. And then you had the Council of Europe also released a convention on essentially personal data protection in 1981. And then certain other European states followed, and eventually you had convergence at an EU level. Meanwhile, there was no convergence in the US and none elsewhere in the globe, I believe. So you had convergence in the EU, and this presented the 1995 Data Protection Directive, and then that's since been replaced in 2016 with the General Data Protection Regulations, so the GDPR. And these have all been fairly principles-based, and you can see now the EU taking it one step further. So in 2020, they released a proposal for the EU Data Governance Act. So you're starting to see some of these formal legal instruments converge with some of the informal ones. So they're moving, I think, Robin, you could change the slide. Moving from these top-down approaches, we also looked at bottom-up approaches related, in this instance, to Swarm. So as you know, much of the distributed ledger based technologies that have emerged over the past 10 years are rooted in a specific ideology, and they usually intend to replace or reject status ideals with a more democratic, egalitarian, maybe libertarian or anarchic models of social organization. And for this shared social contract to emerge, there needs to be some sort of agreement, usually pertaining to a white paper or a shared repository, etc. And with Swarm, they propose the Fair Data Society's Fair Data Principles, which you can find online. You can even suggest edits. It's a real community-based document. And this is the bedrock of that shared social contract to inform the ideology and philosophy of all the Swarm network participants. So we looked at the kind of commonalities between those top-down approaches that I just outlined and what we see in the Fair Data Principles. And briefly just going through some of those consistencies, you have the notion of the individual having kind of choice and consent over what's done with their data. This is anywhere from the Fair Information Practice Principles in the US to the General Data Protection Regulation to the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, but also the more normatively grounded Fair Data Principles echo this with their principles of ownership, control, and consensual access. And these all sit alongside individual rights, at least in Europe in the Fair Data Principles. Then you have other principles relating to the data itself and its quality, how securely it must be stored, the notion that its purpose must be limited, or in the Fair Data Principles, zero data principles. So non-collection of data or personal data particularly is the default. And then what we can see is maybe more kind of top-down data protection frameworks moving towards a more normative-based grounding. So for instance, the GDPR always talks about individual rights, but it also says that processing personal data should be used to serve mankind. And the EU Data Governance Act includes notions of data being shared collaboratively. They also have this notion of data altruism, where people make their data voluntarily available for reuse without compensation for the greater good or purposes of general interest. So kind of taking all of these approaches, we propose that there, rather than seeing them as two separate entities, there are some commonalities between this. And this could maybe be operationalized by decentralized architecture and blockchain technologies, but there are still questions about how they should be realized in practice. And here I'll hand over to Aditya, because he kind of takes this one step further, looks at commons-based governance for these questions. So Aditya, over to you.
Thank you. Actually, Robin, if you could just pull up the last slide, I might as well describe it a little bit. So kind of jumping off from where Ms. Dahl left off, we saw that we see that the Fair Data Principles and Swarm kind of sit between these different ends of the spectrum. So on one hand, you have top-down approaches like the Data Governance Act and the GDPR, which again have their sort of continuity from the Fair Information Principles. And then you have the more bottom-up approaches, such as the Fair Data Principles. And another category of principles that we thought Swarm could draw from or could build around were the principles of the commons. So the commons, just to give a brief introduction, so when we say, like, the term commons is used a lot in various ways, often to just describe things that are open access or things that should be open access. If you could go to the next slide, Robin. But the commons also has a more specific history. The commons is a description for resource systems that would be shared by a group of people, by a community that would be and that would be managed and governed entirely by the community in decentralized ways. More specifically, the theory of the commons comes from an academic called Eleanor Ostrom and her collaborators, who basically examined a lot of instances where communities had sustainably managed resources peacefully without conflict, and without necessarily relying on strong private property rights or centralized state-led or governmental management. Their idea or their theory was basically meant as a critique of what is often known as the tragedy of the commons, which is again the basic idea that if communities are left to their own devices in managing a resource, then the resource will ultimately fail to and fall to overuse or overexploitation. And the thesis there is that you always need private property rights or centralized management to be able to, for communities to sustainably manage resources. But Elinor Ostrom was able to, and her collaborators were able to demonstrate that that isn't necessarily the case. And communities under certain circumstances and given the right conditions are well suited to govern resources in decentralized ways. The idea of the commons comes from the theory around those resources, and it comes from the governance of natural resources. But more recently, because the internet and digital goods are so easily conceived as commons, there's been a lot of extension of that theory to things like data, to things like open source software and free software, and the idea of the knowledge commons and the digital commons. So there's been an extension of that theory to be able to better describe why certain communities can be strengthened, why certain communities can work online and how they can be strengthened in their management of the knowledge and the digital commons. So commons, so the commons literature and the commons theory has been described as descriptive, constitutive, and expressive. Which means the theory of the commons is useful as a language to be able to describe commons where you see them, in the way that, for example, we now see decentralized resources, decentralized architectures as a form of commons potentially. The theory is constitutive because using that language and using the resources from this sort of intellectual project, it gives you tools to construct commons, to construct new commons, to identify problems of governance and propose commons-based tools to address them. And commons is expressive because there is an inherent ideology, a normative claim, and an assertion that we see certain resources as better managed when they are left to the community to manage them. So the next slide. So more, yeah, actually, we can go to the next slide. I think I've covered this. Yes. So one of the key contributions that Elinor Ostrom made was describing design principles for sustainable commons. So based on a lot of empirical analysis and work, Ostrom and her collaborators developed these 8 principles or best practices, which seem to be always present in instances of successful commons. So I won't get into all of them, but so they were things like having clearly defined boundaries around the resource and the community. So having a clear idea on who can access the resource and what the resource is that is available to the community, having rules that are proportionate in terms of their incentives for participation, and are also suited to the local norms of the community and the nature of the resource. Having different mechanisms that allow people that are affected by rules to be able to participate in how those rules are made and modified. And having different sort of mechanisms for monitoring those rules and having ways of ensuring that non-compliance is addressed, and having ways of dispute resolution and making sure that the ability of the ability of the commons and the community to self-govern is recognized by external authorities. So by their description, where successful commons had in some form or the other, the presence of these 8 principles. So what we decided to do was to extend this lens to decentralized architectures and to Swarm, and to see and to sort of translate them into to sort of iterate and translate them into something that might be more applicable to decentralized architectures. And that led us to the next slide, Robin. Then that led us to what we've described as provocations. So the idea was that if we have a sense of the elements of sustainable community and decentralized management of a resource. Maybe if we were to translate them to the decentralized, to be applicable to decentralized architectures, they can help us design better strategies for sustainable governance, or they can help sort of direct our thinking about what sort of problems or issues may arise, or what kind of governance strategies might be useful to be able to maintain a sustainable community around the architecture that we're developing. So some of the provocations that we came up with were, is there established methods for the community to engage in governance decisions, rule formation, and modification? So the broader issue of participation. So the question there is, to what extent is the community able to participate in governance? And that can be at the level of technical architecture, but also in terms of off-chain governance and behaviors. And then related to that is, are there proportionate incentives for participation in the maintenance and the governance of the network? And this can be from the perspective of users that use the architecture, and to some extent that is built into the protocols as well. But this also applies to the people that are developing and maintaining the network. And how can maintainers and developers remain aligned and accountable to the community? So to some extent, we have this in terms of the fair data principles, but it is an open question about how closely we can ensure that we can maintain alignment with those principles, and whether there are off-chain behaviors that could negatively impact the network, and if there can be agreed upon rules for those behaviors, and whether there can be dispute resolution processes that can mediate those concerns as well. So yeah, with that, I think I'll hand off to Robin to discuss the Wikimedia.
That was great. Thanks, Aditya, and thanks, Mistal. So I guess that's a very kind of quick high-level overview of sort of what we did learn. So what was easy to trace between the existing principles-based frameworks that had come from the top, or the status-based frameworks, and also some of the design principles that have sort of evolved over time and been looked at theoretically and practically by researchers. But even though it was easy to draw lines and relationships between certain principles and ideologies and governance frameworks, there's still a lot that we don't know, right? And there's still a lot that we need to figure out as a community, as researchers, as developers, as governors, as maintainers. And this is where we thought it'd be really interesting to bring someone in, including everyone here in this talk today, to discuss and tease out some of the nuances and complexities of these types of questions. So I want to bring in Toby Negrin, who, as Chirp mentioned earlier, was the former Chief Product Officer at Wikimedia Foundation. And it would be good, really, I think, to get Toby's perspective on some of these questions. So Toby, if you're there, maybe you can just say hello and give a short introduction to everyone.
Hi, thanks, Robin, and thanks, Mistal and Aditya, for a really cool presentation. So as Robin said, I'm Toby Negrin. I was the Chief Product Officer at the Wikimedia Foundation for 4 years, and I worked at the foundation for 8 years. And I have long been interested in decentralized movements and technology, open source, open knowledge, and now open data. And now I'm been involved with Swarm. We're trying to put a censor-resistant version of Wikipedia on their infrastructure, and I'm really excited to be here and share I think some of the practical challenges that we ran into at the Wikimedia Foundation.
That's great. Thanks, Toby. So, I mean, the first question was one that I was dying to ask when we had a little side chat just in preparation for this. So, like, what was difficult about building Wikipedia, the foundation? Talk to us about some of the problem points or the pain points that you faced along your journey with them.
Well, I think that the first thing to say is the Wikimedia Foundation is sort of, we like to say we were not a foundation with a community, we were a community with a foundation. And so I think a lot of the incredible productivity of the community actually came from the community itself. Sort of drawing a parallel with the model in the slide deck. This was almost completely a bottoms-up enterprise. And so I think the problems that we ran into. One of the things that product managers always talk about is having like an incredibly engaged and passionate community. Well, we had one, and when the foundation and the community weren't on the same page, this was really difficult. And I think there was while every knowledge community had its own set of rules, I don't think that the interface between the foundation and the community was, I think, well established. And so that might be something to think about, as we sort of move into this next stage of the internet, and decentralization is built into the protocols as opposed to layered on top of them.
Yeah, this is something that you mentioned, this idea that there were little sub-communities within the community itself. And while there was sort of like an overarching ideology that everyone shared, the practicalities of that was a little bit more difficult because different geographical spreads, different demographics would impose different wants and needs and goals, I suppose, for the commons in itself. And that led to a few difficulties. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think most of us are familiar with English Wikipedia, and if you speak and understand other languages, you probably know that there are other language Wikipedias. What you may not know is that each of these is its own sort of distinct community. And while we like to think of ourselves as sort of representatives of free knowledge, some people in the communities thought that way and other people didn't. For example, when we were trying to roll out a new version of talk pages, which is how the community discusses articles, we actually had to go to every single language community and say, what do you think? Do you have any input? Would you like us to change anything? And then there were literally hundreds of language communities. So sort of this was the right thing to do because every community has its right to self-determination and to set its own rules. But yeah, like you were saying, it's a lot of overhead. And especially for people coming from, a centralized world, right? Like if you worked for one of the big web platforms, you could just say, we're doing this. And some of your users might complain, some don't, but you could do it. At the foundation, we couldn't do that, right? We actually had to get permission to roll out new software. And so probably made it more successful, but it certainly made it slower in terms of actually making changes.
I want to bring Aditya in here because Aditya, one of the commons principles you mentioned was this idea of nested enterprises. And I thought that maybe is there a relationship or something we can learn from that concept or that idea and how it's applied to this idea of mini sub-communities that don't necessarily always see the same?
Yeah, I think there's a strong intersection that I see there. So yeah, the last principle is nested enterprises, which basically says that the commons operates on different levels and of nestedness. And it's also described as the principle of subsidiarity, which means you have as like decision making is as localized as possible. So the lowest level at which you have the capacity, the appropriate capacity to make decisions, that's where it should be made. So it very much tracks with like the idea of having communities within communities, and to the extent sustainable and feasible, allowing those communities, allowing the nested communities to self-govern. To the extent that it's feasible and sustainable. I think like an example that it's not the most perfect example, but it's, for example, the way Reddit's moderation works. How you obviously have like these overarching policies, which are often defined by top-down regulation as well. But then within communities, you have a lot of self-management of the way moderation processes work, what moderation policies are, and how moderators are even supposed to function. So I think that's an example, another example of how like you might see something like that in online communities. And it's no surprise to me that like it makes sense for something like Wikipedia to also function like that.
I mean, in a certain sense, Wikipedia sort of had like this kind of general legal overlay that also played into moderation, right? Like the communities get to decide what is published on Wikipedia, right? And they all have their own processes, but over that is sort of legal rules that differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction around things like copyright, acceptable content, sort of law enforcement aspect, and things of that nature. So there is, there is some precedent in the wiki movement around this sort of, nesting of smaller subcommunities under larger jurisdictions.
Just a thought that came to mind. In some ways, the Wikimedia Foundation itself was almost like an interface between the very kind of bottoms-up decentralized community building that was going on in practice and the more top-down pressure that was perhaps coming from the regulatory environment that the Wikipedia itself had to sit in, right? And it was probably fundamental to its A, success, and B, probably popularity, I guess.
Yeah, that's actually a great point. And I think, initially the foundation was created to buy servers, right? Like in the early, it's back in the early days of this century, right? Wikipedia was, relatively small, and it got really popular. And so they decided to put up some banners saying, hey, we need some money for a second server. And then they realized, with Wikipedia's reach, that actually a lot of people wanted to donate. A lot of people found it very valuable. And sort of out of this, yes, the foundation was born as not only just an interface to the practicalities of running a big web service, but as you pointed out, dealing with the various jurisdictions.
I just want to bring Ms. Stahl in on this, maybe, because I know your background is in law and the interface of data protection law specifically. I mean, how does the top-down approach, I should say, how would that deal with this concept of nested enterprises and nested sub-communities, if it does at all, or if it could at all?
I think it would be the way that Toby just mentioned. So it would be kind of geographically limited, so per jurisdiction. And because there might not be, in that top-down approach, especially to something like data protection, there's not a shared global norm or necessarily even a regional norm. These enterprises would be nested within that. So in terms of top-down, it is really, there are kind of geographical boundaries built on the internet, and then it would just cover things like what Toby said: data protection law, copyright law, intellectual property law, content moderation. So there's no collective just yet from that approach.
I mean, it's pretty fascinating to think of, Web3 technologies, and specifically cryptocurrencies, have sort of created like an extra jurisdictional reality. Can we do that around a public good? I think is one of the real questions here. What do you think, Nastal? Is this something that Web3 could just sort of create?
I don't know. I think it's something that law doesn't have the answer to. And then you look at kind of community-based norms as a form of regulation, which exactly raises these sorts of questions when it's on a decentralized system. But then eventually the law will have to catch up, but that'll be far behind the technology. So it's difficult to find the marriage between the two.
That's great. So I think we could maybe move on to the second point, but I just want to make sure, Chert and Tomas, I know you're paying attention to the chat. If there's any participation, please feel free to just shout it out. If anybody wants us to extrapolate, or perhaps has a comment or a question based on that first point.
So I think there would be one, that would be applicable maybe to these things that were mentioned. Can I just use this opportunity also to know that we have prizes at the hackathon for putting Wikipedia data on decentralized storage, as well as for searching on it? But to the question, so Wikipedia is a good example of a bottom-up build system, if you would agree, a data commons. Swarm could solve the storage aspect, but there's a twist to it also. So it should be relatively easy to fork a Wikipedia on Swarm and maintain sort of a parallel version of it in the sense of having multiple truths available, right? So does it make you easy in a way? And so, okay, it's actually a composite question. So, and how do you see the interplay between accountability, transparency, and freedom of action, and the legal compliance that Toby mentioned? So, how do you deal with state censoring actors, and taking account also this forking option? Maybe if you can comment on that.
Let's see, the panel is for 8 hours, right? So for us to really discuss this. I mean, I think it's a great question, and I'll just say that one of the things we liked to say at the foundation was that Wikipedia worked in practice, but not in theory, right? Like, you really couldn't, sort of back in the turn of the century, you really couldn't, say we're going to make an encyclopedia that anyone can edit. Like, how could this possibly work? Well, it turned out that it did work, and one of the reasons that it did work was that I think there was a real community belief in establishing norms and systems to actually make it work. And so I think this is like a really, like, the movement aspect of it and the common goal is really important. Here, and I think that really speaks to, the sense of purpose that free knowledge had at the beginning of the century, and maybe some of the sense of purpose around Web3 today, as far as decentralization.
So, but for example, if these multiple truths emerge, and some of them maybe some governments think that some versions of them should be censored, other governments think other versions should be censored, and actually you cannot censor it. So how does this fit in maybe legally into the whole story?
Ms. Dahl or Aditya, do you have any thoughts on this?
Before I respond, just to what Toby said, I think somebody in that room was a common scholar, because the idea of something working the design principles were created with the philosophy that if something works in practice, let's see how it works in theory. So it was very much a sort of grounded analysis of looking at existing models of like sustainable communities and like trying to extrapolate theory from it. So so it like very much tracks with what you just said. To the question, I think it's a valid and completely open question. I mean, on one hand, decentralization and decentralized approaches, especially when it's a question of content, so on one hand, it makes it like the value is that it's like censorship resistant. But at the same time, I do think there is still need for governance, need for addressing harmful content, need for addressing even potentially like copyright related stuff, although my personal politics aren't based on my personal politics, like the copyright isn't the most important thing. I would say it's an open question, and I think it's I guess I don't have an answer to it, but I think I just want to emphasize and be explicit about like on one hand, we do have censorship resistance, which is a good thing, but then I think we still have to figure out how we might still bring in the moderation that we might still want from a healthy and sustainable community that is open to people to be able to use.
Hey, or Ms. Stahl, did you have any thoughts before I start?
No, nothing to add to that. Go ahead.
And what taking a step back, like one of the while we think of we might think of Wikipedia articles as being sort of these static objects that represent sort of known knowledge about a specific topic. That's not actually the case, right? They all change over time, and I think that's one of the things that when you explain how Wikipedia works to people, and you say, oh, it's moderated by regular people and it changes over time, they find initially sort of very off-putting, right? They don't like it. So, if you sort of take that into sort of an extra-jurisdictional or a global outlook, maybe that is the answer, right? That you just, you take this model and you apply it, but you do have to have some understanding on the consumers that these things, that these things change, and that your version of knowledge may change over time. I think that the thing that is really important here, I think, is to represent that free knowledge isn't just the work of one person or one point of view, be it state or corporate or whatever, but it's actually essentially assembled and moderated by whoever wants to participate according to the rules. And even though that's sort of a de facto model, I think it's something that has been studied and can be studied, and potentially provide some solutions to the questions.
That's great. Thanks, Toby. Just when Chert was mentioning forking, I just imagined bifurcated knowledge commons where you need a little track changes module to try and compare and contrast across all these different chains of truth. And I just imagine it being a nightmare.
Well, it's actually fascinating. So I remember when the Japanese government came to Wikipedia about the specific naming of, I won't get into the politics, but the name of a body of water between Japan and China. And they had a specific request. We actually pointed them at a community discussion where this name had been discussed and a compromise had been arranged. And there's actually this name was different in different communities. So, sort of like, yes, knowledge is bifurcating, but it also, we need a way to represent that, some things, there are different points of view about different things. And I think that's one of the most fascinating things about the multilingual aspect of Wikipedia, right? Like the actual knowledge is different depending on your point of view.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. Okay, so I think there was something that when we had this little preparatory chat for this, was something that you said, Toby, and I wanted to kind of extrapolate this and maybe share it with the community here. Is you had this phrase, and you kind of said that open source as an ideology has sort of been co-opted. I won't say by who. You can kind of put in your inverted commas there, but open knowledge itself is still a fertile ground. And I just wondered if you can just elaborate on that and maybe talk to us about that opinion or how it was formed or what you think we could learn from it, not to make the same mistakes when it comes to knowledge.
Absolutely. So first and foremost, I should say this is not my idea. It actually comes from a presentation by Benjamin Mako Hill, who's an academic, I think, at the University of Washington in the States. And I would definitely recommend that you take a look at his work on the knowledge commons. He's just really an amazing researcher and thinker about this. But his point was that, and this was really influential in helping me understand sort of the roots of Wikipedia. So, back when many of you were children, open source, back at the turn of the century, open source and open knowledge were sort of considered the same thing. And in fact, some of the people who built early pieces of Wikipedia were actually also editing articles, right? And so these things were actually, they were, you could not separate them from each other. But over the past 20 years, I think open source has grown from sort of this rebel movement to really something that everybody expects. And so things like collaborative development, using decentralized systems like Git, things of that nature have really been co-opted by large corporations. And that word has negative connotations. And I think there's some negativity here, but also like we found out that these things have worked. And so it's, I think, pretty natural for everybody to start using them. So open source has actually become sort of this thing that everybody does and no one really thinks too much about it. And over time, the licenses have become less restrictive. Open knowledge, however, seems to have diverged, right? And I think, you look across the world and free knowledge, open knowledge is actually more under attack than any time that I've been alive, with misinformation, censorship, and things of that nature. So, when Wikipedia really sort of thought about the future of the projects, it was really, making sure that open knowledge was supported both legally and from a technological basis, because people would sort of come to expect that, yeah, sort of we are all smarter than one of us, which is sort of I think one of the underlying principles of the open movement.
That's great. Just open this up to the community, maybe. Cherd, is there anything on this? I thought this might be a bit of a provocative statement, especially since open source and the FOSS movement is close to a lot of people's hearts.
Yeah, there is a discussion in Discord about open knowledge being a fertile ground. So I think the question is, what can we do about it to be even more accessible? I guess it's a pretty open-ended question. So,
well, I think for me, the sort of the decentralized nature of Swarm is a really exciting foundation to build on, right? Like, if I mean, you see some of the work that's being done and making internet services available over Tor in Russia right now. I think this is an example of technology actually enabling certain affordances. And so I think this is one of my real interests in Web3 technology and real decentralization. Can this help keep open knowledge? Can this help make open knowledge available? And that's certainly one of the things that I find most interesting about Web3.
Yeah, I think it's important, just from my perspective on this, is important. Web3 technologies in themselves can sometimes become quite clunky, quite cumbersome, quite complex. And I think in order for this to work, there's got to be real efforts put towards things like accessibility, you sort of mentioned, but of course, things like usability, not only on the interface side, but also on the experience side, right? What we don't want to do is create some sort of knowledge barrier just to be able to interface with the knowledge, the open knowledge, right? You don't want to put a gate in front of the field as such, right? You just want to let the field an open playground for people.
Yeah, 100%. And I think one of the challenges that Wikipedia is facing is this idea of participation, right? Like right now, the encyclopedia is primarily written by people from the States and from Europe. And one of our challenges was essentially, how do we make it more global? How do we get everybody's point of view, right? Like, English is, as a colonial language, is spoken all over the world, but the rules for English Wikipedia are set by a relatively small group of people. And sort of how can we expand this? That was one of the real challenges that the foundation faced. And I think it sort of, there is accessibility, there is participation, and there's also sustainability, right? Because, being able to donate free knowledge is in some ways a privilege. And so adding a sort of a sustainability layer might be an interesting way to really get global participation where we couldn't before.
So should we squeeze in another question maybe, or?
Yeah, please, if there's one, yeah, please.
So in the introductions part of the article about designing the data hive, right? Principle-based decentralized architectures, you seem to argue that bottom-up initiatives are leveraging peer-to-peer technologies such as Swarm. Would you suggest that any data commons on top of Swarm should be built bottom-up, or would top-down approaches maybe also work? Like, for example, a large organization providing data that could later be managed by a commons. And additionally, what do you see as the main challenge of a bottom-up approach?
Who wants to tackle? Toby?
I'll take a quick poke at it, then open the floor. So Wikipedia had literally, we didn't track usage in this way, but we estimate that Wikipedia had probably more than 1 billion readers, right? Billion is a big number. Wikipedia has about 250,000 editors, right? And so consumption of free knowledge, right, everybody cares about, but actually production is a much smaller number. So I think this is one of the real challenges around open data and privacy and usage, is actually creating the awareness that this is something that you should care about. Because I feel like right now, there's a lot of sort of nebulous concerns about how our data is used on the internet. And that is prompting top-down restrictions that people can appreciate. But I think until, we can get sort of general awareness that this is important. That's one of, I think, the real impediments in a bottoms-up approach.
I can jump in with just a quick comment from a slightly related field. To answer the question, I think you can have like bottom up as well as top down approaches. I think in some ways, top down approach is more likely to succeed because it already has like, it might be building from like existing momentum, might not have issues of resources. So that's one thing, but then I think it depends on, I don't know, the benevolence of whoever is trying to set it up. Like, how if it's top down, like how empowering might it be at the end of the day? I think I will always have just a bit more distrust. At the same time, I think the challenges from it, and this is speaking from a slightly related field. So I've also been involved in communities that are trying to do decentralized governance, but not through technology, but through institutional and legal mechanisms. So like the conversations that are happening around data trusts, for example, or data cooperatives. And one of the problems that we've seen is that there's a lot of interest in trying to create these models, but it's been a difficulty to have it connect with an actual community that would take it up. So it's kind of sometimes kind of felt like a solution in search of like a problem. So it's like the idea being, I mean, you could have the idea of a Wikipedia and have all of the technical expertise and the organizational ability to set it up. But if you don't have people that connect with the idea of openly sharing knowledge and openly contributing knowledge, it's still not going to work. So that's I think so. I see that problem, or I see that concern even with something like when you're developing something on decentralized architecture like Swarm.
That's great, and it sort of leads into the third question, right? So, what characteristics that currently exist in Web3 can impact on the commons? So we've talked a little bit about how there may be a kind of sort of contribution consumption asymmetry. So are there existing technologies that can perhaps create a more equal, create more symmetry in that relationship? And alternatively, are there kind of negative characteristics of the Web3 kind of blockchain domain that may negatively impact on development of commons? I know, Toby, you had discussed this before, and maybe you want to jump in here.
Yeah, totally. I mean, when I think there are two things that, in my view, that the Web3 platform needs to deal with before we can really, move into sort of thinking about the commons space. And the first is environmental impacts, right? Like there's a ton of work, I understand, at moving from proof of work to proof of stake, but still the two major platforms have definitely bad environmental impact. And for a lot of people, that's sort of the deal killer. The second thing is, I think that there is sort of this, and I'll just say this, sort of a get rich quick mentality, particularly in the crypto space. And obviously, if you're really into the knowledge commons, this is also anathema. So I think really the Web3 movement as a whole has to sort of, be able to deal with these things. Proof of work is critical to the technology actually working, but then there are other solutions. And of course, sustainability, as we've talked about, is just an important part of everything. But these two things really do stand out as areas for improvement. But that said, I really, when I read some of the things written about decentralization, back in the day, and I think, then we were sort of, decentralizing against, written encyclopedias and, for open source, sort of the dominance of Microsoft in the 90s. Now we have a sort of a different set of actors. Web3 in many ways philosophically is like incredibly aligned with some of the early goals of open source and open knowledge.
There was one topic that's come up, and Toby, you discussed this a little bit, the concepts kind of like micropayments and incentivization schemes to try and boost the levels of contribution. Initially, obviously, when building Wikipedia, there wasn't, this explicit monetary incentivization at all, right? It was done from an ideology or philosophy or you know, a donation to the public good. And Aditya, I know you've talked about how incentivizations and micropayments or systems that may incentivize contribution may actually skew motives. So, you know, perhaps Aditya, you want to jump in on some of the kind of negative connotations and the negative potential impacts of putting incentivization schemes in a commons architecture or a commons framework?
To be fair, I do think, I think my position on skewing incentives is a bit stronger on the question of like incentivizing data provision, especially when it's personal data. And I don't think I have the same reservations when it comes to contributing something like a knowledge repository or like a Wikipedia. So yeah, I guess I don't have as strong reservations. Then but it is an open question. Like it does skew incentives, right? When the contributions are on one, in one instance coming from, you know, the love of knowledge and sharing, and the other being and in the other situation, like a monetary benefit that's associated with it. Maybe it's a bit idealistic, but I'm myself curious about how that might skew incentives, and I'd actually love to hear from Toby about how he thinks that might, if there might be some potential negative implications of a system like that.
Yeah, well, let me tell you a story. So we one of our goals when I worked at the foundation was to actually increase participation around the world, and so, you know, one of the first things that we did was we actually made sure that our mobile editing interfaces actually worked. Wikipedia was primarily a desktop experience. We changed that to enable people to edit on their phones, right? That's the predominant way people access the internet in the world. And so we did some pilots in a few countries, and in the Arabic Wikipedia, one of the things that we saw was people were taking their profile pages and they were sort of turning them into, they started to look like CVs. And we didn't really understand why they were doing that. Like people would sort of have their name and so their education and then the articles that they worked on. And then we realized what they were doing was it was actually creating sort of a, you know, like a real CV in the sense that like, here is this person and here are all the areas that they knew. And it was really so to sort of establish like their expertise. It was mostly in areas like computer science. It was really to help them, you know, young people trying to get hired. And so I think this really illustrates like one of the realities about global participation. And I think one of the really interesting areas of Web 3.0 or Web 3.0, I'm dating myself, Web 3, is that, you know, if we built, you know, taking advantage of some of the mechanisms, can we actually use micropayments and things of that nature to make actually editing the commons, adding to the commons, sustainable for everybody? I think this is really interesting. We certainly saw at Wiki, we certainly saw our users moving in that direction.
Do you think it would skew the kind of the psychology of participation, though, if there was money involved, or you know, low-hanging fruit that was essentially a dollar sign or a Bitcoin sign or a Ethereum sign?
Yes, definitely. I think that there really is, like, one of the things that holds the community together, right, is this like feeling of altruism, and we're doing something good for the world together. But, you know, it's like things are different now, and perhaps we can find a way of, you know, fairly compensating people for their work in a way that encourages participation while not losing that sense of altruism, right? Because I mean, I think this is not only a problem for, you know, editors, but it's also a problem for the nonprofits that are essentially stewards of free knowledge, right? You know, most of these organizations are funded by donors. If there's a way that they can be funded by their users, you know, like I think at Wikipedia, you know, the number of people that actually donated was vanishingly small compared to the number of people who use the encyclopedia. If there's a way in using Web3 tech to sort of make to build in compensation or build in sustainability among the wider users. That's really exciting.
I know, Aditya, that this brings me back to you, because I know you've discussed in the past, the concept of data trust and monetizing data trust, and perhaps creating a pool, a value resource pool that then would be distributed back out to the community. I don't know if you want to jump in and perhaps elaborate on that.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. I want to say that as much as I think it's important to think about how monetization may skew incentives, I will also say that I do think it's a bit it's a slightly privileged take to say that we shouldn't compensate people, because as Toby mentioned earlier, that it is a privilege to be able to contribute. That there is privilege associated with the ability to have the time and the money and the resources and the energy to do something like this. And one of the negative implications of that is, again, what we mentioned, the kind of knowledge that is represented on Wikipedia as well. It is extremely centered around the global north and the west. So I do think there's a strong case for exploring ways to compensate, the ways to measure contributions and to compensate it and then look out for ways that don't break the system too much. It actually reminded me of David Graeber, who's a anthropologist anarchist who wrote this book called Bullshit Jobs, and he made this observation that the closer your work or contribution is to actually helping society, the lower your pay is, and for some reason we accept that state of affairs as a society. But anyway, to get to your question as well, yeah, I think the other thought that I had about this is and this I think ties with the idea of open source being co-opted as well, is I think just as much as we think about addressing contributions or compensating contributions within the network, I think we should also think critically about how value is taken away from the network. And I think that is, for example, one of the ways in which open source has been co-opted, that you have people putting in so much time and effort and labor into creating this infrastructure that then is monetized by other companies. So we haven't, and that has been, I think, one of the failures of the open source movement, that we didn't think as critically about maintaining value, especially in the ways that we interacted with the outer, with the other, the outer world. So I think it's so I think when we think about value, it's firstly also a question of how we maintain and preserve value when we engage with the outer world, and then also how we have and one of the ways, as I mentioned, at least for data, my preference is not for it necessarily to be a one-to-one, my data, my contribution, and my money, but maybe at the level of the collective. And I think because I think that can in some ways preserve incentives better than maybe, like I said, a one-to-one transactional model.
That's great. Okay, so in the interest of time, I want to maybe move on to the fourth point, and this is something, Mistal, I want to bring you in here, because you actually raised this point when we were discussing with Toby about the sort of the balance between representativeness, I think you called it, and the kind of the ideal of anonymous or pseudonymous participation. So I don't know, Mistal, if you want to jump in, maybe elaborate on the idea and the issues that we saw and discussed a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So this flowed from Toby saying that they didn't profile contributors as such. They mainly relied to Wikipedia articles. They mainly relied on their geographical location when they were doing it. And that's how they realized that it was skewed towards kind of the US and Western European contributors. And I was kind of posing the question of, yes, this is in line with a lot of data privacy principles and protects that individual's privacy by not collecting a lot of information about them, not running the risk of profiling them. But then if the contributors, and then not necessarily representative, at least geographically, but you can imagine in other ways as well, how could the two coexist? So protecting the privacy while achieving a goal of making sure that the distribution is widespread. And I'll just preface this with the notion that often data protection rules or laws are incongruent with other interests or concerns. So they often stop the free flow of information or stymie freedom of expression, and a lot of security concerns, like law enforcement agencies have lots of issues with retrieving data about potential criminals, even in really serious situations, because the law's quite restrictive. So yeah, the question then to Toby is, how does this anonymous participation square with representativeness or a lack thereof?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I mean, one of the principles of the Wikimedia movement was to essentially break down the walls around who got to describe knowledge, right? Before Wikipedia and before things like Encarta, which is an online encyclopedia that I don't think it exists anymore. You went to the library and there was sort of this book of knowledge, and if that was how knowledge was described. And so, one of the things about Wikipedia was to enable everyone to be able to contribute, and that was super important. And we definitely, inside, and so I think I should say at Wikimedia, we made a decision, and this was very much in line with what our communities wanted, was to not do this kind of extensive profiling. And so, we just didn't know a lot about our editors and very little about our readers. And while this made our job harder, it was absolutely in line. So when we did start to think more around representation, it definitely presented, sort of this quandary, right? Like, how do we actually deal with this? And I think, the way that the tool that was available at Wikipedia was essentially to look at the content, right? And because we didn't necessarily know a lot about our users, but we knew a lot about the knowledge that was represented in Wikipedia and the other projects. And so that was essentially sort of our balance between privacy and anonymity, and the actual output was essentially, how many of the articles are, how many of the biographies are about women as opposed to men, how many were from the global South as opposed to the global North. And, hopefully, as we move these ideas into practice, we'll be able to find trade-offs like that. But it definitely made things, I don't think we had a really great answer to that situation, right? Because, for many people, the anonymity was an important part of the process.
I suppose just to add on this and to make it even more complex, I mean, if you start thinking about monetizing contribution or incentivizing contribution, you're going to run into another problem where people may be gaming the system and perhaps trying to skew the incentives that they receive, or skew the tokens they receive or the money they receive by creating dozens of different accounts, potentially from different locations, different demographics, etc., and so on.
Robin, just to that point, like one of the sort of the de facto currencies in Wikiland is the number of edits that you have, right? And one of the things we wrestled with was, well, what about the quality of the edits, right? Like, if you really wanted to juice your edit count, you could break down your edit into, your big edit into lots of little edits. So yeah, this is like a problem that the Wikimedia world faces today.
So I don't know, Chert, I'll throw this out to the group maybe, and if maybe there's some interesting perspectives on how to balance perhaps this kind of need or desire for anonymity or privacy and perhaps elements around reputation and representativeness.
So if I may maybe jump in with an opinion. So listening to you, I think that we have like different business models for Wikipedia and for some kind of other periodical maybe, where you get actually paid for content. Wikipedia is based on actually reputation, I think, right? And if you start paying for that, you lose these enthusiasts that are doing it for reputation. So this probably wouldn't work to actually pay people for this. But it is about reputation, and reputation can be built up with an anonymous avatar, so to say, right? You can have like this you can be a real life person, but a different avatar in Wikipedia, right? It's you maybe publish something that people don't like, but you're anonymous, yet still your content can be popular. So just my 2 cents. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we had planned to close the chat at about 1:15. So I don't know, Toby or Mistal or Aditya, if you have any final comments, please feel free.
And could I just squeeze in another question so we can?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
So yesterday the talks were about DAOs, right? Decentralized autonomous organizations. So not sure if you were able to attend and listen in, and how familiar you are actually, but so could this technology help solving up data trust or data cooperatives, setting up kind of commons? What do you think? So would a DAO be an appropriate technology to tackle these challenges? And could the DAO be maybe used for somehow for Wikipedia?
Maybe I'll grab this really quickly. I mean, sure. I think that of all the Web 1, Web 2 properties, Wikipedia is probably the most DAO-like. And I think it would be really interesting to sort of take some of the technological affordances of DAOs and sort of back test them against the way the wiki communities have evolved, because there's a lot of similarities, but I do think it comes down to some of the effects of monetization and sort of, does that have corrosive effects on the community itself? But yeah, I think that would be a fascinating, if I were a PhD student, I would love to take that on. It's fascinating.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to quickly add, I mean, this is by the way part of my PhD, so I'm very happy to kind of know that this is such an active conversation. Yeah, to sort of reiterate, I think there's 2 ways I see like DAOs and commons, for example, intersecting, right? Like one is exactly how Toby described it, that there might be technological affordances. There might be affordances that are unique to these technologies that enable us to do governance better. So, like questions of like monitoring, or questions of accountability, or questions of participation that might otherwise require sort of organizational approaches, or, just the goodwill of the people. You might be able to like execute them technologically in ways that are more powerful and more sustainable. So that's one way that I think it's appropriate and suitable to look at them together. At the same time, I do think that like there are off-chain behaviors as well. I don't think you can completely sort of like magic away issues of of basically people being people. And there again, I think the commons and some of these principles can give you a lot of direction in how you might begin to address some of the remaining challenges as well.
Fantastic. Okay, I think unless there's any other comments and questions, Mistal, I don't know if you wanted to have any kind of final thoughts on this.
No final thoughts. I think it's really interesting, and it definitely can be explored further. I think we've managed to end up on lots of open questions rather than closed answers.
Yeah, I'd agree. A lot more discussion, I think, and fleshing out of the complexities and nuances. Toby, I'll leave the final comments or final remarks to you. So please close us out.
Cool. Well, yeah, just a big thanks to Mistal and Aditya and you, Robin, for your great moderation. I guess just and you too for helping organize. I think just I just will go back to the energy and the passion that I feel around Web3 and sort of taking, the next iteration of the internet, and how much I feel that that's aligned with the same energy that went into creating Wikipedia and many other open knowledge projects at the beginning of the century. So just like keep building, everybody, keep thinking about these problems.
That's great. So thank you everybody for listening. I'll hand back over to you, Chert. I'll stop sharing my screen, but thank you everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Robin, Mistal, Aditya, Toby. So we're a bit ahead of schedule. This is planned so to have more time maybe for presentations. And I would like to invite actually Salman to the stage to present. So Salman, if you can turn on. Hi, Salman. Yes, I can see you. So at the beginning, I did a short intro, and you will also do an introduction yourself. So I would just leave you to take over now.
Sure. I will first share my screen.
I can see it, yes.
Perfect.
Oh, you're starting way back. Okay, Salman, I'll hide myself now. So go on.
Yeah, so I've been kind of an entrepreneur and venture capitalist for the past 20 years, but I've had this obsession with personal servers, and this talk is about that. And yes, I am starting a little bit way back, and that's because in one of the first sessions of this hackathon, actually, it was Gregor who started reminiscing about the good old days when software came on disks and we stored our data on our computers, where we controlled our data rather than storing it on the cloud and other people's servers, and having no control over our data and the environment it's running in. And I agree. And actually, this computer is my first computer was a Sharp IMSI 80K, which had 80K of memory, and put data on cassette tapes, which you could which were fully portable because I could take it to my friend's house and have control over it. But seriously, my question is, what if we use Swarm rather than cassette tapes as our data storage, as a foundation where we can store both our apps and our data, just like on our old computers, but at internet speeds and with all the convenience of the cloud and Web 2.0. What would that look like? And wouldn't that be like liberating our data? Of course, I think it would. And I built this simple middleware layer or gateway, and this is I call Freezer, that allows you to have your personal server run on Swarm, like your own PC, but in the cloud. And my talk here is really a demo for sort of front-end developers or even novices who can build simple front-end pages. And so, like, if you've already built some Web 2.0 front-end apps you love using like a to-do list or whatever, you can convert them to this environment and have your app run on Web3. And there's even a bounty for that on Gitcoin. Actually, there's 2 bounties on that on Gitcoin. But let me show you what that would look like for the user first, or I like to call it the data owner's perspective. And then I'll get to the kind of the developer's perspective and demo what you would need to do to convert your Web 2 front-end facing app to this environment. So this is my personal server, salmanff.com. And if you go there, you'll see that I post some blogs there and I post some links. That's what you see. Obviously, if from my perspective, I have a home page, and on my home page, I have some apps. Like I have my blog posting app called Poster, where I write my blog posts and post them on my website. And I have Notary, which is a note-taking app, which I can sort of take notes on, like for this conference. And it doesn't need to be on the web. I actually sort of have, obviously you can have iPhone apps or just a desktop app that takes you through, where you can take your notes. But so, this is like a regular server, but there's a major difference with the way it's built. And that's that this, like my personal server here, all of my data is actually sitting on my Dropbox, and we'll get to Swarm, but for the moment that here we're talking about Dropbox, my data is on Dropbox. So for example, if I, this is my Dropbox that you see here, if I go to my, a folder called users freezer, and I go to my files, and I go to sort of this poster app, you can see, the JPEGs, like when you go on my website, this picture will be served from my Dropbox onto your site through my server, which is on Freezer. And Freezer also has this notion of apps, which are just bundles of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files. So basically an app, my apps are also code as data. So my apps are also sitting on my Dropbox and being served from my Dropbox when you go on to the web page or what have you. So this is the app actually sitting on my Dropbox being served up on my personal server. So I control my data and my apps in my environment. It's a little bit faster than cassette tapes, but it is under my control. And this is the kind of the architecture that I want to show you. So because the apps are also just these pieces of code, these text files of code, to install apps, all I have to do is actually just say, hey, there's a bunch of files sitting on this, GitHub repo. Just go and grab those and put them on my personal data storage space and serve them from there. And that's what downloading or installing an app is, sort of like the old PCs. But I'm not going to install an app here yet. What I want to go to next is basically, how do you get yourself a Freezer server? So if you go actually on the Freezer website, which is freezer.info, on install Freezer, you get a bunch of different instructions. It's based on node. You can basically put it on any cloud server. You can put it on localhost or what have you. One of the easier ways to actually install Freezer is to go to alpha0.herokuapp.com, where there's kind of like an alpha page for testing, and you'll see some sort of some test posts here. And if you go to login and register as a new personal server, here you can set up your Freezer. So to do that, basically you can choose your file system, and you can use Dropbox like we did before. You can use FairDrive, which is where it starts to get interesting. So I'm going to use this gateway, which is the FairDrive gateway. And I've actually set up here, I may need to log in here again. So this is a demo. So basically I've set up this drive, but there's nothing on it, right? But I have my credentials. So I'm just going to copy and paste my credentials. There's actually the user here is a user called WAM Freezer user. So I'm going to put the WAM Freezer user here, and I'm going to add my credentials, my passwords into FairDrive. And I'm going to use a name. We'll call it a WAM demo user. So this is my, this is my username to get into Freezer. And the one below here is my FairDrive credentials. And basically what you're doing is you're handing a key to Freezer, saying, hey, here's a key, manage my storage space for me. And you have a choice of different databases here. I'm going to say, hey, use my file system on FairDrive as my database. And if the demo gods are working with us, I can press launch, and it takes a couple of minutes to actually set up the system on the server. While it's doing that, I will just pull up another slide, which is to basically show you the architecture of Freezer. Basically, so what's going on here is that when you're on a browser, basically Freezer acts as this gateway. It keeps your credentials and your keys for you, and it allows you to store your files, whether it's your app file, your actual application or your data on your personal storage, which is, could be Google or Dropbox or what have you, but here we're talking about FairDrive. And by the way, this is now set up. So I have my freezer, but I'm just going to finish this slide. Basically, so the browser comes in, goes through the gateway, gets the credentials, grabs the files to serve them to you, and uses an API to access your data. And the API is based on the specification that we created among a bunch of enthusiasts for personal servers to allow for any app to communicate with any personal server by using a common set of endpoints. So this came out of the mydata.org conference a couple of years ago. And it's called the common endpoints for personal servers. So it uses kind of this standard to communicate with the server and grab data back and show it to you. So we have our we have our environment, we have our freezer server, our personal server. As easy as that. How do I download data here, or how do I download an app? So there's a couple of ways, but the easiest way is actually, just like I said before, point to a repository on GitHub and say, hey, there's an app sitting here called Poster, or com.salmonff.poster. Can you please go ahead and download it? So basically, then it downloads that app. So basically, anybody could create an app and put it on their repo, and anybody else can just point to it and download it and put it on their personal server. And while that is downloading, so basically now I have Poster running on my server that I just set up. And if I go here, I can normally. Sometimes this needs to be logged on again, so hopefully this will work, but let me just log on again here and go to my drive. You see that Freezer has created on the same account on my FairDrive a pod, and in that pod here we have, sometimes it takes a little bit of time to get this, but basically you have a pod, it's got a user's freezer, within that user's freezer it's got my username, and within that username I have my apps and my database and my files, and under my apps obviously I have I have my Poster app running. And that's what is being served up here. So that's how you create. And so then when I go to my homepage, that is my homepage. So right now we saw how you could actually set up a freezer, a server, your own personal server very easily, and download an app and run it. And actually running it here, I'm just going to say my first blog, and this will be public. So I'm just going to sort of type, oh shoot, this will be public. I'm not a very good typer, but let's say I'm gonna save this, and basically this also gets saved onto my FairDrive, onto the FairDrive with the FairDrive's credentials that I gave. Oops, sorry. With the FairDrive's credentials, this is now saved on my FairDrive. So that's how you install an app. Let me just, so now this is the user's perspective. Now I want to get to a developer's perspective to say, like, how do I actually develop an app that actually will run on this environment? So this is the hello world of apps that I'm going to show you, or the hello world of Freezer apps. As you can see from the HTML, it's basically an app that just does one thing. You write a note and it saves it. So that's why it's called One Note. It's got a little box where you put in your note, and it's got a button where you save it. For those of you who know programming a little bit, you'll notice that there's no header. So one of the areas where Freezer is different from a regular web page is that the header is injected by Freezer. This is for various reasons, one of them being security, like it sort of disallows iframes, for example, so that an app can't steal the data from another app. And we'll talk about sort of how apps are separated a little bit later on. That's one of the things. The second thing that the Freezer server does is that it injects a file called freezercore.js, which is basically gives any HTML app access to an API so that this app can access the database. So if we go to if you go to the JavaScript, basically what's going on here is just like 20 lines of code. And if you press the save button here, it calls the API to actually create a data record and store your text in the database. That's all it does. And then when you load the page, it uses this other command. So basically, this is showing you how you can access the API to get to the database, and it gets that note and shows it back to you. So very simple functionality. CSS is just sort of standard CSS. You don't need to do anything for that. Or anything different for that. So how do I install this app? Installing apps, you could put it on GitHub and download it, but you can also, this is the app that I'm showing you. It's got 3 files in it. I can just go compress it. And once I compress it, I can, I can go to, on my server, I go to app management. And on this page, I'm going to move this here and I'm going to drop it into onto this page. And so now what's going on is that, sorry for this highlight coming up, that's something different, which I'll show you later. But basically, these files are now this little app is now being copied onto my fair drive, so that you can run that app. And there is a little bit of a latency. It takes just a little bit of time for these files to be copied. But once you do that, you've basically you sort of taken this very simple app and put it on the freezer, and you can take notes. So like say my note. And so I have my note and I can save it, and basically, it says, yeah, you saved your note. And so basically it saves that note onto my fair drive. So again, not the most complex of apps, but the idea here is to show you the very basic interaction of using the API to access the database and sort of build on that to expand the functionality. The other thing that you've seen this. I'm going to build on this and create a slightly more complex app, and this is actually on my GitHub as well. It's called org.mydata.exe. Exe means one in Finnish, so that's also, it's the same thing as OneNote. And if you look at the HTML, it's basically this same app with one difference, which is that if you look here, it's got this publish button. So basically, what I'm going to show you here is how you can share data on Freezer with other servers or with the public. So this publish button basically just publishes the app. And if you go to my, this is just the same code sitting on GitHub. So I'm going to actually download that, let it install. So if I go to salmonff and say, hey, download org.mydata.exe, it's going to download these files and install them on my fair drive. And I'm just going to show you while it's doing that, I'll show you the JavaScript. Basically, it's just like one extra thing, which is if you press the publish button, it calls for the share records. And it calls the share records on Freezer to allow you to share. And in this case, you're granting the permission to share this record with the public. So basically, you're publishing it. You could also grant the permission to, sort of show a post to a friend or a group of friends. So it allows that functionality. And all of this is actually based on SEPs, which is the specification that I talked about. And I should also mention that if you go to freezer.info and go under tech specs, you'll see the core API with all the different commands that you can call when you build an app to call any of these commands to do whatever you want with your personal data. So let's launch this app. So again, it's the same interface as you saw before. It's amazing design. So I'm going to sort of write a note here, my publishable note, which is different from before. I'm going to save it. It's going to go save my note. And then I'm going to say, hey, publish this. Now, publishing is a little bit different here. And you have to think about, the reason it took a little bit of time, it says basically, look, you can't publish this note. You haven't granted permissions yet. Because you don't want an app just to like publish stuff just willy-nilly, and you would want to have some sort of control over that. And this is in a way the same as like on a smartphone. an app asks for a location, your app can't just use your location. You got to go to like the operating system and say, hey, yes, allow this app to see my location. Same thing with Freezer. So when you install a Freezer Freezer app, you get this little button on the apps, and it gives you some information about the apps. And one of them is to say, hey, this app is asking for permission to publish. And if you press accept, for example, you're going to go to, in a way, the operating system. You're going to go to another URL, which is separated from the app, where you can confirm that, hey, yes, it's okay. I want this app to be able to publish stuff. And once I do that, I can then go on and publish. Hopefully, yes. And yes, you've published your node. And in fact, so now this is published. And if we cut and paste this, and let's say, if actually any of you can just go to this website now, it will drive you to the public page. You'll see that this this new node is actually now live on the website. It's just been published, and it doesn't look very pretty, but it's been published, and we'll get to the pretty part later. But I'm going to just go and show you one other file here to see how that's done. Again, this is also based on the SEP specification, where apps can ask for permissions. And here, this app is asking for permission. So within this manifest, the app is asking for permission to share records and from a particular table. And this is the permission that I granted. So basically, within this framework and within SEPs, apps can ask for permission to, for example, see another app's data, or to be able to share records. So those permissions are defined within a very simple JSON file, so that apps can have flexibility while giving the data owner, the user, access to or the control to say which app can do what. And actually, so if you go back to, if I go back to my Freezer and open Poster, which is my blog posting app, this is where you see a manifest, which is a little bit more complex, where I can define pages which have, more CSS files and more script files, so that it's not just index.js. You can sort of build more complex web pages. You can define the data types, and you can ask for, and you can sort of ask for more complex permissions. So for example, if I go back to my, if I want to go back to my apps here and go to this Poster app that I installed on FairDrive, I can, first I have to accept these permissions, say, yes, this Poster can also publish things. There we go. So now that this is published, now I can sort of basically publish this, and I click through a couple of things here, and now this is also published. So basically, if you go to this URL, you'll see that this my incredible prose here is published on the AlphaZero Freezer webpage. So basically, when you go there, you'll see that it's a slightly better formatted version of this one, when there is no way to format it. Is based on it's based on an HTML file where you can actually format what data can be shown on the public server. So that's a demo. I want to. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time. Chair, you can interrupt me and let me know, but I'm going to go back to my presentation for a second and talk about a couple of caveats and conclude, and then and then maybe show you a couple of other things, hopefully, if there's time. So first, yeah, you saw a little bit of latency. The latency is partly, I think, sort of a lack of functionality right now on the FairDrive API, like renaming files, which I use a lot to do the database, which is based on NEDB, for those of you who might know, and part of it on my side, where obviously the Freezer could be doing things better. The gateway that FairDrive has right now is fantastic. I can't wait for the desktop versions where I can pay for my postage stamps. Right now, the postage stamps are limited, and so sort of so create some instability over time because, well, Freezer obviously is a work in progress. It's experimental as is FairDrive, and so you're going to, as a developer, you'll see a little bit of quirkiness around these things. But I guess what I've tried to present here is basically this architecture, and the architecture is, the most important thing about the architecture is that it allows for this data storage layer to be the core, and this server to be like a thin, almost powerless layer. So, maybe we can think about Freezer more like a doorman than a gateway, meaning that you can always fire your doorman or grab the key from it and give it to someone else. So, unlike the Web 2 architecture, where the server has gained primacy because it controls your data and the environment your apps operate in, here you're giving autonomy and freedom to your data and the apps you control. So here as a data owner, not only can you just grab your data and your app data and just move somewhere else, you have the ability to decide which app can access which part of your data because it's totally under your control. The architecture also tries to use open and standard components as much as possible, because obviously the last thing you want is for some gateway or doorman becoming like a gatekeeper with some proprietary technology. So the idea is that this thin server layer can be fully defined by specifications and by APIs that anyone can implement. So obviously, whatever Freezer is open source and you can, install it in different places and what have you, and anybody can do it. But really it's about sort of like all of these things are specifications that anybody can implement in better ways, and certainly better ways than I have. So there's a storage API that can access different kinds of storage from, FairDrive to Dropbox, to Google, to AWS, to others. There's a SEP specification, which starts to define all the interactions that apps have with the servers and can be extended more to make sure that the server component remains like this doorman that you can always change and nothing more than that. And then apps are just, HTML and JavaScript and CSS files, things that, flat text files, basically, that millions of developers have been using for the past 20 years that can be run on any computer, right? So hopefully, some of you will see this and be able to convert or build front-end web apps on this architecture. And there's, claim these 2 bounties that the Fair Data Society has so generously offered for apps. So here's some links. I will post those links as well, and you can see them. I'll post them on salmonff.com, and you can go see them. And I want to thank Chert and the Fair Data Society for inviting me to present here. And if you, Chert, again, interrupt me if I'm taking too much time, but I want to just show you one other thing, which I sort of skipped out, which I think is important to demonstrate this idea that basically, all Freezer is a place where you give a key. Actually, I want to show 2 things, but one of them is this. And if I go to, this is the account that we created on FairDrive. So I have my FairDrive's credentials, right? And so basically I can go to this Freezer and it's got my password already as well. And basically tell this server, alpha0freezer.herokuapp.com, just remove me, get me out of here. And I've been removed. So I am no longer on the server. I've removed the key from the server. And if I now go to my public page, my posts are gone as well. I control this. And what's good is I can put it somewhere else. So, right now, I talked about Freezer being able to be installed in different places very easily. So what's going on in Web 2, actually, which I think is absolutely amazing, is that, Web 2 technologies and the cloud has become so evolved. Like if you look at the B2B space, and there's a blog post that I've written about it that's posted on the FairDrive website, the B2B space has advanced so much. Things have become so easy to do that it's really easy to set up your own server, like almost computers can do it. So I'm going to show you, hopefully this will work. The demo gods have been cooperating for the moment. But if you go to glitch.com, you'll see that there's a Freezer server there, right? And I can, this Freezer server is just sort of like other Freezer servers that would be installed anywhere else. The difference is that I can remix this. So, and remixing means that I can basically take that code and say, hey, set up my own server on my URL, right? So if Glitch cooperates, what's going to happen here is that Glitch is basically recreating a server URL on Glitch's servers effectively for me, but it's a URL that I control. So I don't have to, be in under the control of this, Alpha Zero Heroku app. I can have my own URL, and if actually I pay them, I can have actually like my own, sort of claim my own URL name. I'm hoping that this will not take too much time. There is, it's taking a little bit of time, so maybe I will.
No problem. Can we just maybe try to? Hi, Salman. Sorry for interrupting you.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So maybe we can tackle some question while we wait for Glitch to. It's a name that guarantees not to work, right? Glitch, but
no, Glitch is fantastic. It's a great place. It's always used to work, and recently it's been. As I try to do this demo, the Glitch has been a little bit glitchy. But anyways, yes, happy to answer questions.
So first off, you said there were 2 bounties. I think there are more bounties that you can use Freezer actually to complete, because, for example, just off the top of my mind, there is one where you can publish a blog post using Web3 technologies, and you could do that through Freezer. It's in the requirement section. It's allowed. So, and I think more than that to exist. But yes, let me go quickly to questions. So actually we have more than we'll be able to tackle, but regarding this, sorry, just first let me just say, I fully agree with the comments on Discord. It says, somebody says, and 7 people agree, I love this, Salman, you are my new hero. So.
Okay.
And the question regarding these permissions, is there a specification for them? And also maybe at the same time, how does Freezer allow apps to access other apps' data?
Yeah. So basically, Freezer is a lot of Freezer is based on this SEP specification, and I'll post a link to that as well. In fact, there are. I will, now that I'm still sharing screens, I have my these. Oops, sorry. There's a bunch of useful links that I sent to you that I'll post, but one of them is to this common endpoints, which is basically the SEP specification that we worked on, which is what a lot of Freezer is based on. It's a little sort of SEPs plus because it's a little bit more functionality. And part of what SEP says is that an app can ask for permission to ask for other. So apps are the names of apps are in reverse domain notation. So you saw that it was sort of like com.salmonff.poster. So any app can access any data table that is sort of starts by its name. But if it wants to access another table, it just sort of asks for permission in the manifest, and it's defined in the specification, very much the same way that we saw here. So basically, I don't actually have an app that does that here. Here on GitHub, I don't think, but basically the same way that this publish post asks for permission to publish, you can ask for permission to access another data table, either as to read it or to read and write. And it's as simple as that. So, and this is the other thing that I was going to show you, which I can show you if you like. Is sort of basically that means that I can have an app. For example, I have an app which is the thing that kept popping up, which is a chart. It's sort of like it's called ViewLog. It's on the App Store, the Chrome store. It's allowed for bookmarking, but it also stores all my history, all my browsing history. So basically, somebody else could create an app that I just download that just asks for permission to access all my browsing history and just shows it to me or does something fun with it. So that would be a really cool app because it allows one app to interact with another app fully under my control. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. So maybe we could just quickly switch tabs to Glitch to see if that works, but otherwise, yeah, we have to actually.
No, sorry, I don't know what's going on here. But let me just tell you what I was going to show you here for a second. Is that normally Glitch just sort of remixes this and basically allows you to take control of that. Or basically have that server running, so you can sign up as an admin. And what I was going to show you is that if you enter the same credentials, suddenly all of the stuff that we just entered together can be accessed via your Glitch, basically, and your server. And for some reason that is not happening. So anyways, and that's the idea of taking the key and giving it to somebody else.
Thank you, Salman. This was a very inspiring presentation. So for the next speaker, it's actually Mirko from Etherna presenting their video platform. But first we will play a video. So before Mirko joins, we'll play a video presenting the platform. So I'll ask tech support to run that, maybe end screen sharing. I still see the previous screen. I think you can take care of both of those things, right, Kasper? Okay, I'll hide myself. Thank you.
Maybe this is the first time you have heard about Etherna, but what about words like censorship, shadow ban, or privacy violation? Okay, these last were 2 words, but don't you also find them incredibly intrusive? There are realities that we have to live with on a daily basis. We may not always notice them, but they prevent us from being truly free. We are constantly targeted with advertisement and prefer to sacrifice our mental sanity and our individuality in the name of free of charge. But what about freedom? We think that services we use every day are built tailored around us to make us feel comfortable and in full control of the situation. Unfortunately, this has never been the case, or at least not anymore. This because Web 2.0 today is designed around large companies and their needs, not yours. Advertisers indirectly tell us how to live, what to think, what to dress, what we like, what we should and should not to do, and above all, what we can and what we cannot say. At Etherna, we know that if a product is free, then you are the product. We want to take this you and place it at the center of everything. We want the user will be our only real customer. We want people be able to have the only real decision-making power. A system at the service of the community, managed by the community itself, open source and transparent. Forever. With Etherna, users will return to being the only real customers of the platform. To do this, they need to understand that to have a free service, it is necessary to pay for it. Not necessary too much, just enough to cover the value they would have paid individually in hidden costs, losing bits of personal freedom. Hello, I'm Mirko da Corte, I'm the CEO of Etherna, and today I will show you a demo of the platform. This is the homepage of our DApp, and you can see on the top left a menu for configure the referred gateway. We are going to use the default one offered by us, but you can add any compatible gateway, for example a localhost or any other, no problem. And in future you will be able also to set different indexes, for example indexes offered by the community itself in a pure decentralized way. And here in the top right we have management of credit, because Etherna is not using advertisement at all. So every consumed resource is paid directly by the user, and users like creators or reviewers are only our customers. So also monetization for creators is paid by the viewers. You can deposit money, you can withdraw, you can see logs of expenses and gains, and you have an overview of your credit. Now we are using a fake money, so you can deposit as you want, but with the next release we will start to use real money, and we will also add an hour token, the Etherna token, ETRN, that will be provided on next month. Here we have the possibility to view our channel, to configure it, to publish video. So let's see. We have here a list of video that is loading. Okay, this is published directly on Swarm like a feed, so totally decentralized. No one can stop you to publish here. And you can see a thumbnail, a title. Here there is the public published status on current index. We also offer the possibility to offer to others any published content in the platform. This is on our videos, but you can on any other. So if you offer a content, any user is able to view the video at your expenses. This can be useful, for example, for help to spread some content or for embed the videos into an external website. Can make a test. Okay, so now this video is offered to the public. You can customize your channel. You can view the status of your postage batches for publish new content on the platform. Currently we are offering it, but in the future any user can be able to purchase or use its own postage basis if using its node. Now we will try to publish a new video. So let's create, select the content, upload as is. Now is loading the content on the referred gateway. We have an hash of Swarm content, and we can set a title, a sample description, and a thumbnail. Even this is published on Swarm. So we have an hash also for this. Click on publish. Publishing, at first you will try to publish as a Swarm feed, so no one can stop to publish or watch what is listed here. And after publishing on feed, he tried to publish on index, so we can find on page the new video here, and we can try, for example, to vote, to comment, we can play, jump on video, and we can see also here the list of manifests involved with this content. Manifest, video source and thumbnail, we can have a try, for example, copying this hash and going to the gateway offered by Swarm, access, copy paste the hash, find the content. The content is found, and this is the proof that it's real on Swarm. Come back. Okay, here there is possibility to report a video to the index administrator, because for Etherna it's very important to have a healthy community and safe contents, but you will be able, as I said, to change the referred index if you think that our index rules is too strictly for you. So no problem for censorship. It's only due to have an healthy community. And you can also see this content is offered now. And on the left menu you can see some features that have to come. We have frames. Frames are self-managed content containers from community. We will have a lot to say about this in the future. And we have a following tab. Here we will be able to see feeds from your creators. So every creator is able to publish its feed on Swarm feeds. So this is totally unrelated by index and totally decentralized and uncensorable. You also have the possibility to subscribe to playlists. This is other feeds, but not related to single creators. And here we have a list of saved videos. This is managed by the unencrypted Swarm feed, so you will be able to save your preferred videos and never tell us what content they are. So privacy at first place. And this is all. Thank you, and we will see now the roadmap for Etherna. Everything that has been shown so far was just one of the first stages of our adventure. There is still a lot to create and even more to imagine, with the aim of form a more aware and responsible population. For the roadmap we have chosen milestones with important names, from people who have placed the ideal of freedom before themselves. Let's start with Galileo, our first MVP for internal use. In this phase, we tested a proof of concept in which it was possible to upload simple videos to Swarm and view them with an app. The first concepts of profiles and channels were already present, but not much else. Snowden is our first public release, Alpha 1. In this release, we are focused on the features needed to open the service to the public and allow us to start building a healthy and positive community. There are beginning to be the first economic awards for the creators, even if without yet using a real currency of value. We prefer to test the platform before committing to real money. To enable us to grow healthy, we are introducing an invitation-only subscription system. Satoshi is the second public release, Alpha 2. This is all about improving scalability and implementing a real payment system. From now, the platform becomes sustainable and we can grow together with you. Assange introduced the encoding of multimedia files, enabling multi-stream scalability. You can watch high-quality videos from your PC or listen to your favorite podcast from your phone while driving. We also introduce a second index, where the only limit of content will be legality. For the rest, room for imagination. Gandhi introduced the creation and management of frames, self-managed thematic spaces dedicated to the community. With this, the contents on Etherna will be organized, and interaction tools between users will greatly improve. This release will also open up to the possibility of using external indexes maintained directly by the community, totally independent from us, in the app. Mandela is our latest pre-release. It corresponds to a beta phase in which we will focus mainly on the consolidation of the existing functions and on the production of adequate documentation. We want everything to be accessible to the outsider at every level. including the operating code and Etherna's data. With Thankman in Tiananmen Square, we closed the first phase of our roadmap up to the 1.0 release of Etherna. From here on, the imagination is the only limit.
And now I invite Mirko to join us live. So hi, Mirko. So thank you for this great video.
Thank you.
I think you haven't covered everything in this video, right? You have something to tell us.
Yeah. There is still a little surprise today. We are releasing today the first read-only version of the platform at address app.etherna.io. So the video that you have already seen now is accessible on our app, and we are working for release the first public alpha with invitations.
So how does one get an invitation to the alpha?
You can ask for an invitation on our website etherna.io. And you can find it on page a link.
So let me just check for any additional questions. Otherwise, I would ask you about the business model of Etherna. So you do not have advertisements, right? So how will, let's say I create content, maybe theoretically, and how will I learn from it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We don't think that any service sustained by advertisement can be really free, because if there is an advertisement, the customer is not the user, but the company. And so our business model is based on microtransactions. When user consume resources, they will pay for the single resources. So we will not introduce any subscription, but our gateway will tax for download data or storage that you can consume. And this is so also creators will be paid with this method. And this is another interesting thing. The community will be also able to choose how much pay for creators. So this is not an hour variable, but will be calculated day by day with community-based votes.
Great. Can I also, as a creator, set the price for a view?
No, the price is chosen globally by the community for every creator. So because if every creator choose a price, this could be an issue for the final users that clicking on a content that don't know how much they will pay. So we have studied a system for avoid large volatility of prices, but the price is global. Like something a market, but controlled volatility.
I also like that you have this filtering in place, right, for content, because this is something that could get out of hand if inappropriate videos get onto the platform. So this is also great. Okay, any final words, maybe, Mirko?
Any final, excuse me?
Do you have any final words, maybe, before I invite the next?
No, if there is no question, it's okay.
Yes, I don't think there are any additional questions also. I mean, I would have some questions more, but actually the time is also
sure
pressing us. So we'll have a panel after the next presentation where you will,
correct.
You're also invited. So
thank you.
And thank you, Mirko.
Thank you.
I will invite now to the stage Amir and Cody to present the social archive project. Hi, Cody. Hi. You confused me a bit because it says Amir. So hi, Cody and Amir. Yes, I will just let you start, right? Please just check that we can hear you. And
hello,
sure.
Thank
you.
You
want to share a screen, Cody?
Yep.
Cool. So hello, everybody. I'm Amir and from New York, and Cody from California, right? And we come from the Web 2 world. And this is our first foray into the Web3 world. And of course, with gratitude to the Swarm Grants team in giving us the opportunity to build something meaningful, at least what we think, something that we're passionate about, that affects perhaps all of us in some way. So we created this project to figure out how we could reclaim our data. Our data pretty much lives in many different silos across many different servers. Maybe a little brief history on this. I was involved in this primarily from Anand J. Singh, and Taylor Gehring. They have a project called Be Free. They talked to me about it, I think last year. And then that's how we kind of started thinking about these various types of projects. I think it's a big project, and this will be something, that we can make an effort together so we can solve this problem. Maybe you want to say a few words, introduction, Cody?
Yeah, I'll dig into this a little bit more on the principles section, but decentralizing a pretty core component of a lot of people's digital lives is a part of this, but it's also been influenced by some of the censorship or deplatforming, however you want to phrase it, that we've seen here in the States. So it's definitely a close to home project for us.
Cool. So starting off with our mission, it kind of aligns with the Fair Data Society principles to some degree, right? We're talking about three main areas, right? Ownership, access, and interoperability. Ownership is we have our data, which is across so many different silos, and we don't really have access to it. So finding a way to liberate it, and we actually own our own data. That's our key, I would say, mission. Access, providing tools to get that data out of those infrastructures and transfer it to a decentralized infrastructure and autonomous permissioning. What that means is we are in control of our data and we provide access to whatever we want. The third point is interoperability, which is of course working with the Fair Data team and being part of the ecosystem, where the vision is that companies will then reach out to us if they wanted some information from us, and then we are in control on what we give them and not give them to for monetary gain or not, right? Or contribute to research or whatever we want. So these are the key three pillars that we go by.
Keep skipping ahead, sorry about that. Yeah, so to support that liberation of the data, we are working within this vision. At the core of Social Archive is a vision of unbundling the current centralized social media architecture and bringing those pieces apart so that each individual user regains agency over their own data, whether that means being able to preserve it for posterity, enabling access to it, or even being able to sell that data and make their own profit off of their data. Parts of this architecture and the way that this would be different from the current situation would be that you can transfer your personality from one platform to another. And then this platform independence automatically gives you a new level of sovereignty. And then, yeah, you'd be able to fairly get compensated for that data usage too. And then on the right here, we see these are some of the components that we see ourselves connecting to. This is where the interoperability comes in, with platforms like Swarm and FairDrive being what enables each of these components to operate together. Social Archive today, the way that we're tackling this first is enabling you to back up the data that currently exists on these platforms to Swarm. So what that looks like is we're first tackling Twitter because of its public exposure, its access to a large audience, and the deplatforming that we've seen on Twitter. And then we enable a user to take their full profile from Twitter and put that onto Swarm, and then give others access to that profile in a way that's user-friendly, accessible, linkable, so that it can be shared widely, and Twitter is not part of the equation anymore. And then once we've really nailed down Twitter, we want to open this up to other platforms and start to work on that sovereignty between, or independence from, an individual platform.
So adoption, I think that what Cody mentioned is a good point, right? Making the experience seamless. I think we've heard throughout, the talks today that Web3, can be cumbersome to begin with, right? So our primary goal is to provide a solution which is seamless, right? Like how we use our devices. We don't have to connect wallets and just, all of those things. Eventually we'll come to some of those areas, but we want this experience to be completely seamless, so appealing to everybody. And our at least our strategy here in the United States is to attack on two fronts, right? We have connections within the entertainment industry, and and access to some political parties. So over here with the rise of cancel culture, people are you can't say the wrong shit. If you say it, my God, you're done. And with that you might get banned, or there'll be a host of other sanctions on you, right? So that's what we're using. We're using that as as a motivator, right, to get this adoptability. Our first milestone was the web milestone, which Cody will demonstrate. And the second milestone is API connectivity over what we've done. So that kind of goes in line with the principles, which is pretty much like interoperability with other companies that you talked about, that Cody showed. And of course, we're open for collaboration with anybody. We want to continue building this in iterations, and we want to try and figure out how we can onboard some of these personalities. We don't really have the exact business model worked out yet, but this is, again, it's something that we are kind of positioning ourselves to understand with some of these entertainment figures who have millions of followers, and see if we can, work with the social media team and get them on our platform.
All right, so let's go ahead and open up what we have today. So if you want to give us a try, we're at socialarchive.info. This is live and out in the open. And you can upload your archive or access an archive if you have the Swarm hash. We do want to open this up to being able to insert the Twitter handle and find the particular archive that you're looking for, but today it's all hash oriented. So if we go in here, we can go ahead and click Add Archive. Now we're taking advantage of a existing Twitter feature, which actually lets you export all of your data into a compressed archive. So we do require that you go into your Twitter settings, export this archive, and then bring it back and upload it. So if we click Upload, I'm just going to select the most recent copy of our archive here. And then we extract it in the browser, so we can preview the full archive to the user. This is kind of a core component. So we want this flow to be user-friendly, and part of that is not automatically uploading their data to Swarm. We want it to be clear that they're making the choice each step along the way. So this is not yet on Swarm. You're just navigating through it, making sure that everything looks okay. Do I want to upload this? It looks like they're removing, we do remove any private information such as IP addresses and email addresses. You'd be surprised how much personal information there is in your Twitter archive. We do include likes, lists that they created, moments that you've created on your Twitter account. So if you've looked through your data and you're thinking, okay, yeah, I'd like to archive this, we can go ahead and hit confirm. And so at this point, it's compressing that bundle into a single file and uploading it to Swarm. And then it's going to add the archive hash to our Swarm feed so that we can keep track of a running recently uploaded list. So now that it's uploaded, we can go ahead and verify it. And we'll see that it downloads the archive from Swarm, quickly opens it back up, and it looks just like the preview that we saw before. We can navigate it, and I could provide this link to you with the hash, and you'd be able to access the exact same archive from Swarm. And we can go over to the browse page now too, and we can see, it should pop up in a second here. There it is. We can see that it was recently uploaded here, and we can open it from that view as well. This browse page, this is our next area that we're focusing on quite a bit. We want to make it seamless to explore this data, just like you would going to any social media website. We want it to be a friendly experience. And we see a lot of potential here in terms of citations. News agencies want to be able to reference historical social media data. And then similarly on the entertainment side, personalities want to be able to give always accessible links to previous data. So we see a lot of potential in that avenue, and making this data readily accessible is a really big focus of ours. Amir, is there anything you want to add or anything else I should show in this demo?
No, I mean, I think you're spot on, right? I mean, again, in line with the fair data principles, right? We want to, all this data is public. We were thinking about adding a private backup option, but we kind of pushed it down. When you press that confirm or upload to Swarm, it could pop up MetaMask, and you could pay for it, and it could end up, and it could be your own under your key. But we've kind of pushed off for that. There's also the idea about once you upload the data, how do you synchronize? So there's a lot of these questions that we still have to solve, right? We still have to think about. Our goal here was simply to provide a system or an interface that you can look. It's a very good use case of decentralized infrastructure, right? That you can save your backup somewhere else, and then you can easily view it very simply, right, without any issues. And of course, as we go, I think Cody mentioned in execution, as we continue towards this project, we want to incorporate other social media such as TikTok, Instagram, and things like that. So the goal really is to provide access to upload this backup and then connect it with all our other partners. So we could create this social media graph, right? Or recreate the social media graph in a decentralized manner. Right.
With this being the onboarding component where users are incentivized to participate in the system, right? And then we can open up with that interoperability, including front-end library and open API, things of that nature.
Cool. I think that's it. Short and sweet, right? We don't want to take too much of your time. I think you've been through a lot of presentations today.
So I wish we'd had more time, right? We shouldn't have the day so bunched up, I guess. So many interesting things to see, but yeah, we have time for some questions if you would like to answer, right? So let me just start. So a bit more technical, I guess. Who determines partnerships for API connectivity?
we're open. I mean, hey, open source, nobody determines this. You can just come to us and with your idea, and we can see if it fits, in a collaboration. I mean, we are a team of 4 people now, right? And we are growing. If you want to come and contribute to the project, you're more than welcome to, right? The project. Yeah, so does that answer your question?
I think so. So is each new archive stored entirely as a blob, or is there an append?
Is it stored as a new one?
Can you append to an archive, or do
you want to take
Today
that?
It's a full blob. Yeah. We've thought about this a little bit. If we go down the path where these individual archives are linked to a wallet and there's some sort of user verification process, then we can support this updating of the archive. But as it stands today, it is a singular blob tied to a single hash. And that kind of lets us avoid that user verification part. Even though there is this inherent requirement to have access to your Twitter account to get this archive. And we do validation on the archive, so it's pretty hard for you to spoof a Twitter archive. So if you're trying to mock a user to, I don't know, make a fake archive or something, it wouldn't be the most straightforward. But we do want to look into how we would do that sort of appending that is on our list.
How would something like this interact with something like SourceCred?
What is SourceCred?
Yes, so I'm vaguely familiar with it. So maybe we just skip this question for now, and maybe you can continue the discussion on Discord around this. I would continue with maybe if you're planning to. So I can see that this is public data now. If you implemented this option for users to use their own keys, I suppose that adding would be possible. But also, I guess maybe naively asking then, if this was done this way, then you could also support adding. Just adding not as an export, but just using it as a regular Twitter from then on, right? In a sense. Is that something that you plan,
yeah,
or?
True.
Yeah, well, we don't, our goal is
that's not something that.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, we are not currently planning to create that type of interaction, partly because of the real-time nature that it would require. It's just, you're building out a whole nother type of platform at that point. But that kind of tooling could be a way of leveraging what we've built, and that could easily be another application that would plug into this.
And the final question before we move on to the panel. So are you also planning to archive personal parts of this data, right? So it's currently public, but maybe I would want to have my Twitter archive with all the data, but under not visible to others, so just for myself.
Right. Yes, we do. We do have that functionality, in our roadmap, and we did play around with some of those things, and even on top of, I think some of the things, the data we're excluding. I don't know if you saw that, excluding all the ads and the IP addresses. Look, I mean, we talked about the interoperability and some of the fair drive principles. If there are other fair data companies that want access to that data, you should be able to sell their Twitter data, to be honest, right? In that regard. But right now, it's very new, so we redacted all the information, and we want to make sure that we're on the right side of privacy. And then we'll work with the team members, right, from fair data companies, and see how and what we can expose. And of course, we'll be transparent in showing that on the interface, on various options on how you could monetize funds, possibly.
Thank you. So I would just ask you to stay online, stay in this room, and I would invite Salman and Mirko to join, so for a bit of a discussion. Hi, Mirko.
Hi.
Hi, Salman.
Hey again.
So I think you all seen each other's presentations, and what you're doing. So also, if you want to comment on each other's stuff or just lead the conversation, that's also great. But I would maybe kick off with some questions. So obviously, we're all drawn to Web3 technologies for various reasons. And what would you say are the biggest benefits, the things that Web3 really solves that Web2 really cannot, and maybe how much you use this feature in your product? So maybe if Amir, you start.
I'm sure. I mean, I still, to be honest, it's early, right? Early days in Web3. I mean, of course, the decentralized nature, and I'm sure you are all aware of it. The talk about privacy, about your own data. I think it really started with Ethereum, right? When you could say, okay, my money is private. So people in that notion started to think, okay, our data is private, and we are giving this data to all these companies who can then do whatever they want with it. They can make deals, and they can make millions, or they can possibly even breach it. So the idea around privacy and something that maybe I own, right, and I can distribute what I want to distribute, I think is something very powerful from the Web3 perspective, right? Web3 allows you to do some of those maneuvers. However, the infrastructure, I still think, is to some degree not quite there. I think it's still lacking. I mean, if you compare it against the Web2 world, I mean, let's say if I switch what you guys saw with S3, it will be instantly faster, faster, reliable. I mean, just working with some of these technologies, I think we just have to be patient, and then the dream of true decentralization will be built. I guess milestone by milestone.
I think about Web3. Web3 is a very interesting topic because we think about Web3 in technology terms. But I think that Web3 have to be a first mentality set, a philosophy. And this is probably the most difficult part to pass to people. People have to understand that the web is not free. You have to protect your space, your privacy. You have to have awareness of what you are doing on web. Today, I think we are a sort of a midwave of data. Where we have data, we have a capability to communicate, but we still didn't understand the mass. I speak about the mass. We still don't have understood what data are. So I think that Web3 have this scope to move people toward a next conception of data communication. I see this on Web3. I don't know.
Hi guys, I see that chat is out.
Yeah.
I believe the chat is out. So probably let's just wait a second. Maybe he will come in. Just a moment.
Would you like to hear your thoughts, Salman? I was reading your article. Very interesting points, you make.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really have.
Just give me a moment.
I have more articles that we are preparing for publish. If you're interested.
Nice.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I can pitch in too if you like. I think it was interesting that both of you guys sort of talked about the, in a way, the consciousness that Web3 has awakened, so people are aware of their of various issues, which obviously anybody here cares a lot about. And that allows for people to look at alternatives and to try new models. And I think, yeah, I think what is all of that effort and all of these very talented people doing new things is probably one of the most exciting things around Web3. In my article, the one thing that and I gave a talk about this in December at another sort of Web2-ish kind of API conference, is that you know, what's gone on actually in Web 2 on the business, on the B2B side is just so powerful that, you know, what it would be a shame is for Web 3 efforts to like just, you know, sort of dump all of that away and say we want to be pure Web 3, and in a way sort of putting together Web 2 and Web 3 in optimal ways is
correct.
I think is really interesting. And what are those optimal ways? Like I refer to the Moxie article saying, you know, OpenCO, it's not, you know, the law of Web 2. Well, that's okay. That's like a feature, not a bug. You know, or maybe in some ways it's a bug, but in other ways it's a feature, but it's certainly not only a bug. You know, for me, you know, like the part of my demo that failed was the sort of idea of setting up your own server. And a few years ago, I was actually setting up my salmonff.com server. And I was just amazed that, you know, with all, you know, this stuff about privacy was just starting to hit the news, and, you know, your data being locked. And it took me like 15 minutes to switch my domain from one provider to another and set up another server. So, you know, these guys are competing so hard and providing a lot of talented people. You know, the likes of Google and you know, Amazon have these incredible engineers working to provide incredible service for their business to business customers. And it's very different from the B2C world, where we're all kind of get locked into specific business models. And I think that is you know, just I'm sort of inspired by that and all the innovation that's been created on the B2B world, in the SaaS world in the past few years. And for me, the question is, well, how do we bring that into the consumer world and create the same kind of level playing field? And to some extent, that is a promise of Web3. I think what skeptics have been saying is that, well, we've been trying this for the past few years, and, you know, nobody's actually created something that you know, everybody's, you know, dying to use on pure Web3. And I think, you know, part of that is, you know, some of these experiments have to sort of you know, figure out ways to combine that power of what's good about Web 2. It's probably the power of what's good about Web 3. And I think, I mean, anyway, obviously, I like to think that what my sort of little architecture for Freezer is one way of looking at that. And so the power of Web 3 is like the storage that Swarm promises, that FairDrive gives APIs to. I think is incredibly powerful. And to the extent that things that you guys are building, that other people are building on that foundation, and can gain that popularity because they strike a chord, I think that, you know, those are hugely, you know, important sort of steps and great evolution.
Hi guys, I got disconnected, and then I joined in, but I sort of didn't want to disturb you. So I'm now on Wi-Fi, something with the internet. But okay, we're back. Thank you for going on without me. I think you all got a chance to answer to this question, and my other one was about, you know, the drawbacks. So I know that Amir, you have mentioned them already. I'm not sure if Mirko and Salman did that already. So I'm giving you another chance. Maybe if you know what is wrong with Web3, what it needs to be fixed, and maybe even what cannot be fixed with Web3, what you see that cannot be fixed with Web3. That's a more specific question. So if Salman, if you would maybe start with that.
I guess there are two sides of the same coin. I don't know if I'm qualified to talk about all of Web3 and what's wrong with it, or that anybody is. But you know, I think, you know, Amir mentioned the sort of some of the latency issues, which I mentioned around FairDrive as well, which I actually love, and so that's one of the things that I like. I think something like Ethereum Swarm with the FairDrive API can be huge. You can talk about that, you know, short-term downside. Well, that ecosystem hasn't been developed yet, so it needs to be developed. Will they be able to compete with the AWSs of the world? And I think, you know, the downside is that, well, it doesn't, like Amir said, it doesn't have the usability right now, or the speed right now. And the question is, I think what is interesting is to, again, go back to saying, well, what can we build around it or on top of it that either masks that, or in a way uses it in a way where that becomes less relevant, I guess. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, referencing some of the things that someone talked about, previously, just now, where, the positives of Web 2, right, which are very hard to ignore. I mean, as we mentioned, Google and Apple and all these, companies have these amazing resources, right? And amazing guys who are so smart. And, even now, the young guys, they don't know anything about Web3. A bunch of people in New York, can you imagine in downtown New York, you talk about Web3 or Ethereum, just goes over their head. They're like, yeah, we've heard of it, but we don't know. But these guys are very talented in creating some of these, these applications and the whole life cycle. I mean, I feel some of the work that you guys are doing, Chert, is very important, right? You're filling in the gaps by creating these presentations and opportunities for people to collaborate. I think that is, the open source adoption is probably the best thing that, the Web3 has on its side. I think the corporate world uses the open source and then kind of rebrands them as Kinesis or S3, right? A lot of these things were open source, and then they just, put like an enterprise model on it, and then, so they kind of suck out the innovation, I think. So, collaborating between, decentralized projects and, and is something I think that we can get better at. Documentation, of course, it's with open source, as you have to go to the code to find out the answers. So having better documentation around some of those things, better onboarding. I find a lot of these people are they shy away from it because they don't know. They don't know any better. The learning curve initially is so high. So we want to try and dumb it down for them, even to come into the space, right? So, I mean, these are at least some of the things I see that we should build upon the principles that some of these guys have built in Web2, right? As it's solid, strong testing and various types of testing, performance benchmarks, and then try to improve them. But I think maybe we're not ready for those things yet. We are still early.
Yeah, if I can pick up, sorry.
No, please go.
No, if I can pick up on that, you said something which I think is really important. It actually came up in the excellent discussion, which was before our panels, about, and moving Wikimedia to a potential incentive. I think one of the things that's wrong with Web3 is potential, for me, is sometimes, it's some of the hype, which I think is what I found really nice about a lot of these panels is that people don't seem to be fazed by that hype in the talks that I saw in this hackathon, which is great. But some people think that, well, if you just add an incentive layer onto any problem that you have in Web 2, it's going to get magically solved. And clearly that's not the case, and that was discussed. But I think this is where some incentive systems will work, and these need to be really thought through, like you talked about before. And this open source issue that you talk about, Amir, is really important. Like, there are a lot of open source projects and open source developers that don't get paid. That's, how do you solve that problem? What is kind of the market structure? And there's a problem that people have been trying to solve in Web 2. Some people in Web 3 come and say, oh, just add, make it a coin and it will solve itself. And that's not going to happen, right? And the question is, well, maybe a coin is part of it. Maybe it's not. But it's about, how do you create a system where that that incentive works properly. And I think I go back to Web 2. So you mentioned this open source project. Get people create companies, actually create an open source project, and then Amazon offers it for free. And then the open source project is like, oh my God, what are we going to do? So recently, Cockroach, which is a database, created a special license which actually stops Amazon from just redistributing. It's still open source, but Amazon can't distribute it for free. So basically, that can't happen on Node because let's say software project, open source, stuff on NPM, for example, is used by thousands of people. But if for B2B, Amazon has a choke point. So basically Cockroach can tell Amazon, hey, you and Google can't publish this or can't serve this for free, because there's like a choke point in the market. And this is where actually centralization helps their business model, because they're saying, look, you guys are big enough where you're not going to violate my copyright, right? And if there were like thousands of people just sort of, deploying Cockroach on their own servers and they try to enforce this license, it would never work. So for me, that's kind of like, it's an example of a market structure and the way it works that, potentially we can think about, well, how do we apply this to the business models that are being built around and on top of something like Ethereum Swarm, as opposed to, hey, let's just put, make it a coin and it will work.
Yeah, sure. I see an old world that is falling down now with all the restriction, for example, that we are seeing in these days. And when we read that Russia, for example, is creating its own internet, all others that is blocking services to Russians, I know this can't survive long. So Web3 is the solution for these restrictions. I believe that Web3 will rule the next world, and the conflict that we are living today is in deep strictly related to how Web2 has been built on the business model moved by Web2. And the world after the conflict, we need conflict because people is able to evolve only with difficult situations. When always is good, we don't evolve. So I think that after this current world conflict, the world will be decentralized a lot more than now, a lot. And the limitation that I see on this can only be technical, because if you concept Web3 not only like a technology, but like a point of view for the world, if you can solve it, it's not a problem. So perception of unsolvable problems is only technical by my point of view. And I see segmentation like the first over scalability, obviously, problem to solve. Because, for example, today I see a lot of effort on develop layer 2 solutions, but layer 2 solution that, from my point of view, is a workaround. We need to have application able to cooperate in very fast and freely way. So probably I hope that, for example, a sharding blockchain, Ethereum 2, probably will come early, because we really need it. This is my vision.
Okay, so maybe a bit of a provocative question. So I was drawn to the argument in Salman's blog post about serverless application platforms. And I quote, "It's precisely the slow-moving and arguably even technologically under-innovative nature of platforms and protocols that provides the stability needed for fast-moving innovators to build on them." So do you think that Swarm is slow-moving and under-innovative enough to succeed in being a platform to build innovative and fast-moving products on?
Ouch. Was that to me, or should others answer?
I mean, to everyone, yes. But Salman, you can, yes. It's.
I think that certainly that wasn't the way that I intended it. But arguably you need some stability on which to build, and I think I was sort of countering Moxie's points more than anything around that, and saying, well, something like, I don't know, JavaScript does not move very fast. Certainly it needs to be innovative at the beginning, and I think the core of what attracts me to, I think what makes FedDrive and Ethereum Swarm really interesting is that, well, there's like a core of an innovation that, once it's fully in place and the community builds around it, and obviously there can be, I think the promise is that it serves as a platform for innovation to be built on top of it. That's what I was trying to argue, not necessarily that it's, that the stuff on top of it is more innovative than the stuff below it, effectively, right? The platform itself can be the one that keeps innovating, because then it sort of comes back to this centralization. The platform has to be kind of like a platform on which others can innovate. But thank you for picking that up.
So maybe if I rephrase the question a bit, maybe what are you missing in Swarm specifically, Mirko?
There is a lot to build over Swarm. Swarm is, I think, the most interesting base for storage, but not only storage. We, for example, saw PSS for messaging, and is a totally new conception of messaging. There is probably a lot of work to do still, but it's a very, very, very promising project. And for example, Etherna uses as a first-class technology. Is our reference storage. So we believe in Swarm.
Okay, that's great to hear. Amir?
Yeah, going back to your first question, I think like the peers, or like maybe that's a bad word, right? Or the other solutions, right? Decentralized storage solutions. I guess they were into this money grab kind of approach, right? Okay, we're going to demonstrate something very quick, going to raise multi-million and hundreds of millions of dollars, and then try and do that. I think Swarm has not fallen into that mindset. It's taken time. It's taken time to figure out how to solve some of the key problems, right? Which I'm not fully aware of. People way smarter than me have trying to figure out some of these, these problems of running nodes and providing incentivization layers and accessibility to data. So I think that's a good thing, right? That on one part, that's a very good thing that it's taking its time, and then on the other hand, I think the product has been, they're responsive. I find a lot of Swarm development very responsive. So responsive that I think they're putting out these changes as breaking, right? It's not backwards compatible, which makes sense, right? Because it's still the bleeding edge to some degree. But what I would like for Swarm to get to a point where we have a reference implementation, and then ability to find certain use cases that people want to use. I mean, as Mirko mentioned, it's maybe not only storage, but there's so many other things, right? Like feeds and other layers of incentivization that can be utilized. But the documentation, I feel, is somewhat lacking in some of those areas. But I know some of those use cases are being built as we speak. So I guess the team is striking a balance, right? A natural balance, where they're not trying to go for this instant gratification, but building on top of some of the issues that we found and discussing them, and then taking the time to make sure that they mature.
Yes, I think Swarm has advanced a lot in the recent periods. I think we can feel that. But yeah, it is cutting edge or bleeding edge, as you say. So there are some issues still. But so I would like to thank you, all three of you, for your participation. So this was really great. The things that you're building are also very exciting, great. I would, before I call Yusuf to join us, I would ask you, maybe each of you, if you have any final words or something to say about your projects to those that are listening, maybe what you would expect someone to contribute, or how they can help, or something in that respect. Amir, maybe you would start.
Sure, give us feedback. We want feedback from everybody. If it sucks, say it sucks. And so we can make it better. I think what we really focus on is iterating on user feedback and making it very simple, and of course utilizing and helping out our friends and partners, right? So yes, so please feel free, do give it a try. I think the link is on the deck, right? I don't know if the decks are shared. Yeah. And of course, if you want to help out and contribute, we are open. We welcome you with open arms.
So if you have anything to share, also please post it to Discord, to general or state chat channel, so that anything that you want to share with the people participating at WAM goes for all of you, of course. Thank you, Amir. Mirko, would you continue?
Yeah. For Etherna, we want to grow. We need to grow. It's a very ambitious project, and we are only on the top of the iceberg now with the Etherna vision, and we really need to spread our project to people and help. We need help also for find developers, investors. We need to grow like a company. So this is a field where this Swarm group can help us a lot.
Thank you, Mirko. I hope we can help you more. Salman?
Yeah, it's if there are developers out there in the audience that want to build on Freezer, build a Freezer app, and they have questions, feel free to reach out on I don't know, I guess on GitHub or on Discord. And maybe that would be the best place. And I'm happy to help you navigate if you like.
Thank you so much. So guys, it's been great having you. I would invite Yusuf to join us for the final presentation of the UE Experience app. Hi, Yusuf.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Chert. Thank you, team. You all have been wonderful with everything that you've been sharing. It's been quite a session and exciting things I would have to say for the Web 3.0. Yes, Chert.
Sorry, Amir, could you turn the camera off, please, just so that Yusuf can have the screen for himself? Thank you. Yusuf, I will also tune out. Maybe just if you want to share your screen, let's try if that works, and then I'll give you the floor.
Of course.
Okay. Yes, it works. So let me just disappear.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, thank you everybody for attending today's session. I will be covering our latest app that we have developed, and it's called the UE Experience app. And of course, it's built on decentralized technology. To be specific, it's built upon FairOS or FairDrive, ultimately upon Swarm. So basically, to begin with, I'll just go to the next slide. So what exactly is the app that we've built? Basically, the UE Experience app is another app that will allow users to capture their day-to-day activity from a journaling perspective and from an emotional perspective. Basically, the app will allow the users to fill out a questionnaire with questions that will be of course fine-tuned by research, and those questions will mainly circle back to the activities that the user is having, places that they're going, capturing moments, how they feel at the exact moment when they're with somebody else, or for example during a specific activity. And this now begs the question, how is our app different from the other apps? Because there are already apps who usually do this. And I will quote Brian Brooks when he was explaining Web 3.0 to the Senate back in December in the United States, where he said that Web 1.0 was just reading only. And then Web 2.0 was reading and writing. But Web 3.0 is reading, writing, and owning. Basically, with our app, since it's built on decentralized technology, the user will be owning their own data, and we will not have any sort of access or any sort of visibility towards the data that the user is inputting towards the app. Basically, it's all encrypted, and they are the only ones who have access to their data, basically. And then what they decide to do with it, it's completely up to the user. Moving on for the forward coming up slides, we have prepared some. It's a demo basically where we have prepared screen sharing from the app inside, how the app looks like. And again, this is just the beginning of the app. Basically, we've just closed the circuit of an MVP, and we certainly are looking forward for more feedback. But without any further ado, basically, as any other app, we have initially the sign up screen, which basically would enter your full name, email address, and password. And I would like also to mention here that if you already have an existing account with FairDrive, you can simply just input that over here, and you would be able to log into your Experience app. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Your Experience app is built upon FairOS and FairDrive. Once you input your email address, basically your full name, email address, and password, you would be taken towards the rest of the onboarding for the app, which basically will ask you a couple of questions about permissions that will, of course, you will need to grant in order for us to send notifications, reminder notifications, and similar things of those nature. We'll just give a couple of seconds so then we can continue with the rest of the videos here as well. Basically, this is the part where you go through the onboarding of the app. You can allow to participate in different researches that we have in mind to incorporate in the near future. And of course, you'd go through the security steps as well for the app. Once you have your app, or once you're completed with the onboarding, you will be presented to the home screen, which basically in the home screen, you will see different sets of submitted questionnaires or submitted data that you've done by answering questions. And then also down at the bottom, you'd have your notes, which would entail the full questionnaires. And then, of course, we have the settings screen where you can switch on and off a couple of security features, and of course, change details. One thing that I would like to point out specifically here is that we've implemented a feature where a user is able to export their data in a JSON file or CSV file. Once the user exports the data as a JSON file, they will be able to directly upload that file with their data onto FairOS or FairDrive specifically. And from there, they can either share with anybody they like, or they can just keep it for themselves. Moving on, basically, just to begin with, we've loaded a initial questionnaire that will just ask a couple of daily activity questions. For example, once you get a notification from the app, you'd have to fill in a questionnaire, and then the questionnaire would ask you about your daily activities. For example, where are you? And you can either choose from one of the locations that are currently there, or you can just add an additional location by your preference, depending on where you are. And moving onwards, then you have also the rest of the questions. For example, the other one would be, who are you with? And the other one would be, what are you doing? Basically, so you can tell the activity, what are you doing, what it is that you're doing at the moment, and time that you're answering the question. And the important part here is that once you enter the activity, once you enter the activity that you're doing, who you are with, and the place you're at, we intentionally wanted to ask, what is it that you're experiencing currently at the moment? Is it a feeling of joy? Is it a feeling of satisfaction? Are you dissatisfied? Or maybe something an event is happening that just pulls you down emotionally. And then, of course, you would rate that experience or that emotion with 1 to 5. And we also included a description box where you can just enter additional details if you'd like to get more in depth in that section. And of course, we also added a option to take a photo for the event that's currently going on, or for the moment that you're answering the questions. This will certainly help when it comes down. For example, some people would like to take a photo of, or a selfie rather, of their current facial expression at the moment, depending on what they're feeling. Is it a joyful moment, or a moment that is bringing them down emotionally? And once you take this picture, of course, it will be attached to that questionnaire or to that notification that you filled it up, so that later on you can either take a look at it or do your analysis based on the answer that you filled for the questionnaire for that moment. And basically moving onwards to the other screens, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, basically there are three places, or three buttons down into the navigation bar, where you can see the details that you're filling out: the home screen, the note screen, and the settings screen. Now, as far as the settings screen goes, as you can see over here, what we've done is we've implemented a feature that will do the grouping of the questionnaires that you will fill. Basically, the grouping will happen based on the criteria of the emotions that you're experiencing for that moment. And as you can see, for example, the first example says best emotional place. And over here, you will find all of the places for which you filled and answered the questions for positively. For example, we have here bedroom, but it might be the park, or it might be at school, or it might be at somebody's house, because you're attaching, because being present at that specific location has provided you with positive emotions. And technically, we just thought to organize all of the places based on an emotional basis of how that has made you feel when you were filling out the questionnaire. We also do grouping basically on an action basis, human basis, experience basis, such as interacting on a daily basis, and also basically what are you most common presence? Are you focused? Are you disturbed? Are you going through a tough time and just does not allow you to focus on everything? And for each of these categories, you will be able to go in and check out the notes that you have filled in for those specific moments. Now, in the notes screen, you will be able to see all of your submitted questionnaires. So for example, every day as you go in and you fill out a questionnaire, or as you journal throughout your way, you will be able to see them here in the notes screen, and you'll be able to see all of the details that you have there. And we've added a feature or a filter over here where you can just filter the submitted questionnaires by either on a weekly basis, monthly basis, or a yearly basis. For example, assuming we are 2024 at this point, and you would like to go back and look at some questionnaires that you'd filled out back in 2023, you'd be able to do that and just make a comparison of your emotional state 1 year ago and how do you stand now currently as you've continued or evolved for a further year. Now, in the settings screen, we tried to make it as simple as possible for the MVP, but we also wanted to include an option which allows basically the user to export their data in a JSON file or CSV file. The good thing about that is the user will be able to upload that file directly into Fair Drive, from where they can either share it by a link or just store it for themselves there and have it for as long as it would like. Of course, you'll have here the general fields such as name, email, which you can change or edit later on as you go through the stage. You can turn on and off notifications. You can set up a password or a PIN, for which it would be just an additional security feature. However, we highly recommend setting up your Face ID, depending on the device that you will be using, as it will allow a much higher security layer, considering it's biometric. And of course, there are the frequently asked questions, privacy in terms of service of the app. Yeah, basically that is pretty much it for the Your Experience app. We aimed at building an MVP, but of course we've already started on brainstorming additional ideas how we can actually improve this app and add additional features, additional functionalities that will just help out and make it easier for everybody to keep themselves and track. For everybody that is interested to have an early hands-on on the app, we are certainly interested to hear your feedback, any suggestions that you would like to share with us, or anything that you think would be valuable for us in future updates for the app. Just shoot me an email at yusuf@cloverlabs.io, and I'll make sure to add you to the list for beta users, so that once it's out, you can get the app and just start testing it out. That would be basically it for my app. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Yusuf. Maybe just a question or two.
Yes, of course.
So this looks like a very powerful app by itself, and of course, having this option to export to FairDrive unlocks new opportunities. What you can further do with the data, share it with other people, recycle this data for other researchers. Sort of like a circular economy for research. Definitely. Data, or sustainable. And of course, the citizen science aspect. So I hope you had a chance to see the panel just before your presentation, and yes. You were also quite fresh to Web3 arena, absolutely. Right?
Yes.
So I would also ask you to maybe, what difficulties did you encounter? Is it hard to wrap your head around this different concept?
Well, certainly there were the challenges and the I would say quote unquote tough things that we had while developing the app. So of course we're talking about this new technology that is still in the, I would say, exploration phase for at least myself. Simply because it just does not work like traditional technology, as the gentleman before me mentioned. It's not the conventional way of doing things. Basically, as I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, it's Web 3.0, where the user basically read, writes, and owns their data, instead of as they have it being owned in Web 2.0 from the companies like Google, Facebook, so on and so forth. Our challenge was just basically switching from that traditional way of creating an app and having it traditionally hosted in a server, and just making sure that we use the centralized technology like FairOS, so that we remove the factor of being there a server, and we remove the risk factor of something like Cambridge Analytica, which still in Web 2.0 is inevitable of happening with another company.
So what would you say to potential developers going in this direction? How to proceed in their path? Any pointers or tips?
Certainly. My suggestion would be just explore and learn as much as you can. Any connections anybody can make that with people that are already part of Web 3.0, I highly suggest to make them. The team at FairOS has been super helpful with us while we were, of course, trying to figure out the ways and the paths. Having the ability or having that connection with either a mentor or somebody that is super experienced with Web 3.0 certainly helps out. However, I would certainly like to point out that regardless of the fact that it's a challenge for any newcomer to like develop an app or develop something with 3.0 technologies, if they get discouraged, please don't, because the final aim and the final goal is so much greater for everybody, because it allows for such a healthier ecosystem altogether for users worldwide the world.
Okay. Thank you, Yusuf, for the presentation and your answers. So,
thank you for your time.
I will just wrap up this event today. Yes. It's been a quite a long event, and thank you all the attendees for bearing with us all this time. And please continue discussions, chats on Fair Data Society Discord. The team is there. and also a lot of interesting like-minded or even different-minded people, I guess, to discuss things with. And I think the resistance game is also in progress for those of you playing that. So thank you all, and bye-bye.